Welcome welcome all to another live stream. So hopefully everyone is doing well. Today we are going a bit old school. And I actually saw there's a message in the chat already from Jezza, who's asking, is this going to be a review of the debate that happened years ago? So, yeah, whether you want to call it a review or just a reaction or whatever, more of a reaction to the appearance of David Benatar on Sam Harris's podcast, which is at the moment called Making Sense, but I think it was maybe called something else back then. But anyway, so Sam Harris's podcast, it's been it's been running for quite a while now, and in episode 107. So, and first, before I go into all of this, please hello in the chat if you are watching. Rotem is already in the chat, or Rotem. I actually don't know how you pronounce your name. Rotem or Rotem is already in the chat. Obviously, Jezza asked that question. If you're here, if you're watching, please say hello. It's always nice to see who's watching and have a bit of back and forth rather than me just sat here. So let me share my screen and I'll show you what we're going to be looking at. So this is from Sam Harris's website. So he runs this podcast, Making Sense, which it's been going for a while. Episode 107 he did is Life Actually Worth Living, which obviously he's a lay person on this. Well, no, I guess he's more than a lay person because he's interviewed David Benatar, but whoever, sorry, I'm going to sneeze. Sorry about that. Whoever comes up with the titles for his podcast or his videos, they obviously missed the trick there because they put "Is a life actually worth living" rather than worth starting. But at the same time, they're making a title to appeal to the average or to his viewer base who probably won't be familiar with antinatalism. So you've got to make it more, understandable and eye-catching to the average person. But anyway, so he had David Benatar on. There's a little description for you. So let me go back to just me. So so there's a few things I'll quickly go over before we actually start watching. I'll just quickly say hello to a few more people. So Danielle, Joey, Shatom, and Jezza again, and Traxel as well. A tiny bit of just personal background for me on this is that when I've spoken about this a bunch of different points, and I've got a video about it on my channel. But I first heard about antinatalism from overhearing a conversation. But my first proper engagement with antinatalism was a couple months after that, or sometime after that, when I was speaking to some people. I sort of they were friends or acquaintances. I can't remember how well I knew them at the time. After an animal rights demonstration in London, Leicester Square, in a place called Mod Pizza that no longer exists. And we were sat in the basement there, and I was talking to my friend Brad, who actually, if you go way back to the start of my videos, I did a discussion between me and him on our experiences getting vasectomies in the UK. So that's Brad. Then a guy called Michael Green, who is sadly no longer with us, but he was sort of an old school hardcore animal rights activist. Very interesting and inspiring guy. Actually this next weekend I'm volunteering at a sanctuary that actually has a memorial to him. He definitely left an impact. But anyway, and then also George Martin, who many of you will know, who runs Carnism Debunked. He has been on my channel, I can't remember how many times, but at least a few times. We've done reactions to his streams. He's done a few debates on antinatalism. He mostly focusing on veganism. But anyway, so I was talking to them, and I didn't know at the time. George must have brought the topic up. I can't remember how the topic came up, and I didn't know that at least Brad and George were antinatalist. I can't remember if Michael was. It wouldn't surprise me if he was, though. But I was basically talking to them about antinatalism, just trying to learn about it and stuff. Because I found it very interesting, but I wasn't initially I wasn't won over because I just didn't know enough. Anyway, so I had that conversation with them, and then they sent me away to look at it or listen to a few interviews, and this was one of them. So this was actually, if it wasn't the first, it was one of the first videos or interviews I listened to about antinatalism. So this is going right back to the beginning for me. I don't think I've actually listened to it since, really. I might have, and I just forgot, but I don't think I have. So, yeah, that's pretty interesting. There was another thing I was going to say about the about the episode, but I can't remember what it was. So, yeah. Let's quickly go back to the chat, and then I've got a couple more things to go over, and then we will get into the actual reaction. So Massilia is in the chat as well. Welcome, Massilia. Anna, welcome, Anna. Massilia says, oh no, sorry. So I think Massilia is replying to Jezza. So Jezza says, looking forward to listening to this one. I'm usually a fan of Sam Harris's work. Then Rotem says, me too. Sam Harris is probably more open-minded than Jordan Peterson, for example. Yeah, I think Sam Harris, from what I've seen, it's not always the case, but from what I've seen, he often comes at issues from a place of trying to understand and good faith. Doesn't always work out like that, but generally that's my experience of him. Jordan Peterson, he just stoops so low sometimes. I used to have a bit of time for Jordan Peterson, but he's descended into fucking madness and shit. So, and Anna says, remember I said I was going to a baby shower? Oh, yeah, during the last stream. I didn't hear anyone suggest this. This couple should try to have more children in the future, so I guess it could have gone worse. Very nice. I hope that your experience of the baby shower was not intensely awkward or aggravating. Prasad is in the chat as well. Zaki is in the chat, says, just curious, have you and Amanda recorded the panel discussion yet? So there's some random person shouting outside. So yeah, what Zaki's asking about is, so I mentioned this in the last stream, but if you go on my community tab, or posts tab it's now called, I don't like that it's called post tab. I like community tab more. Post tab just sounds weird. But so there's going to be a panel about how to define antinatalism coming out. It has been recorded now. And all I will say is, it has been recorded. I enjoyed it. I thought it went overall well. It was very nice being on a panel with very interesting people, and it is in the process of being edited and reviewed, and it should be out very soon. I don't exactly know when it's going to be out, but if all goes well, in the next couple of days. So, if not sooner, but I don't know. That's all I can say on that for now. But it will be out soon, and once it's out, obviously anyone is free to watch it. I will also be doing a live stream reaction to it, like I'm doing with this podcast episode now. And I'm hoping to get a guest on to join me to do a reaction for that, but we'll see how that goes. And I won't say who the potential guest is at the moment. Cool. Okay. CH23 is in the chat from the US. Someone else is in the chat from Japan. I don't know. I can't read Japanese, so I don't know how to say your name. Sorry. But yeah, where is everyone else from? It'd be interesting to see where in the world is represented. Cool. Okay. Actually, before we start, just like a quick little of another update that people might find interesting. So, obviously, it's Sunday today. Yesterday was Saturday. Yesterday was the National Animal Rights March in London. I'm not sure how many people were there, but we do a march, ends in Parliament Square. There's some talks and blah, 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 all that sort of stuff. I guess you guys know how marches work. But one thing that people might like to hear is that obviously there was a representation of antinatalists there. There wasn't any like explicit representation. It's not like there were like antinatalist banners, but I was there, obviously. George Martin was there. I'm just thinking about anyone else whose name I can share publicly. I mean, there were a bunch of antinatalists there, but I'm just trying to think, is there any other like public facing person? I don't know if Danny Shine was there. Danny Shine might have been there. I didn't see him. But he could have been there because it's something that he would come to. But Danny's quite like independent. He just sort of turns up to things as and when and all that sort of stuff. And then, yeah, I think that's basically everything. We have actually had a couple of donations before we even start. So I'm going to read those out. David's in the chat as well, and Critter as well. I think Critter's going for David's jugular. So yeah, we already have so first of all, to the two people who have already donated, thank you so much for the support. It really helps with covering the costs of everything. So the first one is, oh no, I won't be able to watch live again unless you're planning on going for more than 2 hours again, which 100% this will be longer than 2 hours because the episode itself is like over an hour and a half, so it will take longer than 2 hours to react. Please say hello to everyone in the chat. Hello, everyone in the chat. And give a shout out to any viewers in Scotland. Have we got any viewers in Scotland? Let us know in the chat. And that's from Bovine Blue Stocking. And then we've got a second donation. Says, big up Rastaman Lawrence, a little tip for your spliff fund, bun up Babylon, I and I, etc. I don't know what I and I means, and I don't know what the Babylon reference is, but thank you so much. It won't be going on smoking cannabis, because yeah, that's just not something I really do. I'm not against it. I'm actually quite like liberal and pro on drug regulation and legalization, but just not really my thing. But thank you so much. Cool. I think that is everything. Zachary's in the chat. Welcome, Zachary. I think we can get into it. So, like I said before, this is the episode that we're going to be listening to, reacting to. But again, because I don't trust anymore any of the volume on YouTube videos, I have downloaded it and put it to some nice scenic background again, because I think people quite liked the space background last time. So this time, it's not space, but it is some nice scenic views, landscape views, from a particular country, which it does say at the start. But if anyone wants to guess before we start, then go in the chat and see if you get it. But I think that is everything for now. Welcome, Adam, to the chat. I think we can start.
Welcome to the Waking Up Podcast. This is Sam Harris. Today I'm speaking with David Benatar. David is a professor of philosophy at the University of Cape Town in South Africa. He's the author of a few books: Better Never to Have Been, The Harm of Coming into Existence, and most recently, The Human Predicament, A Candid Guide to Life's Biggest Questions.
Just very quickly, before we go on, we've just had a super chat. First of all, I want to say thank you so much to Veghead, who sent in the super chat. They didn't leave a message. Like when you put in a thing via Streamlabs or super chat, you can leave a message. Veghead, if you want to put a message in the chat, and I can read it out, because you didn't put one on the super chat, then please go ahead. But yeah, if you don't have any message, that is also completely fine. Thank you so much for the contribution.
And he's a philosopher who many of you have wanted me to speak with. I've been getting...
Yeah, I actually remember this bit from when I first watched it, when he said that like many people have been requesting it, which is kind of interesting, because antinatalism is still something that actually like most people haven't even heard of. So I was kind of surprised that there had been enough requests for Sam to speak to Benatar. Yeah, and to be honest, I do think people just like genuinely find this topic interesting. I mean, I've said this before, but whenever I speak to people about it, it's generally, not always, but it's generally quite rare for people to have an actual bad reaction to it. I've actually found that it's much more common for people to have a bad reaction when I've done like vegan outreach. And I think the reason for that, obviously, this is not a massively informed opinion, but this is just my speculation, is that I think with veganism, because it's more well known, a lot of people have already made up their opinion, or they've consumed media that has made up their opinion for them. So they have a reference point to dart back to when they're confronted with the idea. But with antinatalism, because most people have never heard of it, or if they have, they don't know anything about it, when they first start talking to someone about it, I just don't think they formed enough of an opinion or have enough reference material to even have a bad reaction. Obviously, some people still do, but I've found that but to be honest, most people are just genuinely interested.
We raise them to be warriors against evil.
And that's the delayed super chat from Veghead. So thank you again. I've no idea why it's so delayed coming through Streamlabs. I don't know why it does that, but yeah. Anyway, let's continue.
Emails and tweets about him for quite some time. He is perhaps the most prominent exponent of a philosophy called antinatalism, and you will hear much more about that in today's episode. The question for David really is whether or not existence is worth the trouble, and he answers that question with an emphatic no.
That's part of it, obviously. Like, that is a big part of the conversation, but like, I think antinatalism actually more centers on like the morality of creating someone, which is slightly different on is existence worth it.
And this makes for an interesting conversation. As you'll hear, there are a couple of places where our intuitions diverge, and I think you just have to pick which intuition you find most compelling there.
And I've actually been to Iceland, and I think I recognize some of these places. I think I went to them, but I went in winter, or maybe not winter. I think it was, but anyway, it was a colder part of the year, but it wasn't the middle of winter. So a lot of the places did have ice all over them. So they look slightly different in these things.
But we talk about many interesting things. We talk about the asymmetry between the good and bad things in life, the ethics of existential risk, the difference between starting and continuing a life. He sees those as very different. Our built-in bias towards existence and how that may confuse us. The relationship between antinatalism and another position called pro-mortalism, the idea that it would be a good thing if we all died in our sleep tonight. I talk for a few minutes about my notion of the moral landscape. And we also talk about the limits and paradoxes of introspection, how viewing your life in a certain way can actually change what there is to notice about your life. And there are many other topics here. Population ethics is a very rich conversation for those of you who like moral philosophy. And it got me to realize at least one thing that resolves for me at least one of the troubling paradoxes in Derek Parfit's philosophy. So I found it a very valuable conversation, and I hope you do as well. And now I bring you David Benatar.
Just before the episode actually starts, we've got a few new people in the chat. So welcome Adam, Snake Killer, Wise Man, McBeal, Kodak, and Irish Tanky as well.
I'm here with David Benatar. David, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you. Nice to be with you.
So I've been hearing about you for at least a year. I plead unfamiliarity with your books, but people have been emailing me about you. I think they have read some of your articles, and some undoubtedly have read your books. But you have been laying out a philosophy that is quite novel and quite pessimistic and quite interesting. It really strikes to the very core of the question, is life worth living? And your answer to that is a resounding no, at least for those who don't yet exist. And no doubt most of what is interesting in moral philosophy can be brought to bear on this question. Before we dive into your philosophy, give us just a kind of a potted history of what you've been doing intellectually and the kinds of questions you've focused on.
Well, this is one question that I've sort of revisited on multiple occasions and also examined issues related to it.
Yeah, my understanding is that the first time he sort of wrote on antinatalism publicly, I might be wrong on this, but the first time I'm aware of is he wrote an article, I think it was sometime like in the late 90s, a paper called Why It's Always Better Not to Exist or something like that. And Better Never to Have Been is came out in 2006, is basically like the book version of that, much expanded, covers new ground, this sort of stuff. But I think the first time was in the 90s. You know what? It might have even been 1997, which was when I was born, which would be funny. Let me just look it up. Let's continue. I'll look up when it was.
I suppose my broad interests are in moral philosophy, more specifically in practical ethical questions. But often when I look at the practical ethical questions, I'm interested in the theoretical issues that lie behind them. And I suppose in this area of procreative ethics, those two come together quite well. But I have written about other topics as well. Another book that I wrote is called The...
Yeah. It's called Why It Is Better Never to Come Into Existence in the American Philosophical Quarterly. And it was July 1997 when that was published, which was the month I was born. If it was released on the day I was born, that would be hilarious. It doesn't say what day it was, but the fact that came out in the same month I was born is so funny.
Second Sexism, which is about discrimination against men and boys. And then I've written on a range of practical ethical questions.
And you're currently professor of philosophy.
That's correct, in Cape Town.
I've just put the link to that one in the chat. I think that's the first thing he published on it, but I'm not entirely sure. Someone can correct me on that.
So let's just jump in, because this really is fascinating. You describe your view as antinatalism. Is that a coinage from you, or did that view exist before you started working in this area?
I've been asked that question, and quite frankly, I don't know the answer, whether I coined the term or whether I heard it somewhere. I've tried to do some sort of intellectual archaeology to find out whether I did hear it from somewhere else, and I've been unsuccessful. But the idea itself, I think, dates back to much earlier times. One hears it even in ancient times, the idea that it would have been better never to have been born. And a more recent exponent, of course, was Arthur Schopenhauer. So these ideas...
Yeah, although Arthur Schopenhauer's an interesting case. At some point I'll have to do a video on it, but he technically wasn't really an antinatalist. He was extremely pessimistic, but he didn't advocate against procreation, in my understanding. He wasn't antinatalist in that way. For like metaphysical reasons, he had a whole sort of like view of the world where he extrapolated from his view of the world that, it's maybe better to say that he didn't extrapolate from his view of the world that it would we should cease procreating, is my understanding. But there are people who understand Arthur Schopenhauer's stuff like way more than me. But yeah, that's my understanding.
Have been around for a long time, and that doesn't surprise me.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's quite a convergence between your view and Buddhism. I'm sure someone must have pointed that out to you at some point.
Yes, exactly. They have.
Perhaps we'll touch on that, because I have a long-standing interest in Buddhism and related practices like meditation. So just lay out the argument for antinatalism. Make the case for us at the outset here.
So I can't remember if he covers all of them, but one thing we've got to remember, obviously, is that Benatar's famous for putting forward one specific argument, right? Well, okay, technically it's not one argument, but you get what I mean. He's famous for the axiological asymmetry or the value asymmetry. There are other arguments like the risk argument. You've also got consent argument. You've got a whole range of other arguments. I guess you've also got like the misanthropic argument, which Benatar did put forward. Obviously, other people have made similar points. And they might cover the misanthropic argument as well. But obviously, in this interview, they're going to focus on like one main argument. So you're probably not going to get the full spectrum of arguments that people could raise.
Well, perhaps I should clarify what the view is first. So it's the view that we ought not to bring new people into existence.
Just very quickly, we just a message in the chat. So Veghead is asking, does anyone know any antinatalist outreach groups in Scotland and or the UK? I can't find any. So Veghead, there are antinatal. There's actually like a small group of antinatalists in Scotland. They're not necessarily connected up, but there are antinatalists in Scotland, and there is an antinatalist community of sorts for the UK. So we have like semi-regular meetups and do activism in London, and so far my knowledge is that antinatalist activism has only ever been in the UK has only been done in London. So we do it in London sometimes. But if you want to join the community and get involved or be connected with people, then email me. My email is in the description, and I can hook you up. But yeah.
But I think the view is broader that we ought not to bring new sentient beings into existence.
Right.
So this is an interesting one, and actually I won't say any more about that, but this is an interesting one. So obviously, like there's an ongoing sort of, debate, discussion in antinatalism as to whether it's a position that only applies to humans or if it applies to all sentient beings. Now, Benatar takes the view, I take the view, quite a lot of people take the view. I don't know, I can't say this authoritatively, but and obviously I'm going to be slightly biased in my exposure, but my understanding is that most of the people that are sort of seen as antinatalist scholars or antinatalist academics are also sentiocentric. I might be wrong on that because I don't know if there's been an actual like survey or whatever, but that's my understanding. I've done a video on this called Animals in Antinatalism, which you can look up, which explains why I think animals should be included in antinatalism. But the basic idea is the reason that we are antinatalists for humans is because humans can be harmed in some way. So it's wrong to create them to then be vulnerable to harm, is the basic tagline, right? Don't create someone who can suffer, who can be harmed. Well, it's not just humans that can be harmed. All sentient beings can feel pain or suffer to some degree and be harmed. And so we should not, just like we shouldn't be procreating ourselves, we also shouldn't be like, for example, paying for someone to breed animals in a farm. So yeah, in my view, sentient beings should be included in antinatalism. But just to be clear, what I think that means is that we shouldn't be bringing non-human animals into existence. That doesn't necessarily mean that we should be because antinatalism, in my view, is like it's a moral position. So it would only apply to moral agents. So it wouldn't make sense to say, for example, that wild animals are included in antinatalism. Although I understand some people use the language loosely to mean that, like you've got Magnus Vinding's essay, like, speciesism of leaving nature alone, and the case for wildlife antinatalism. But in my view, the antinatalist position doesn't include wild animals. I feel like you can have a separate position on that, which isn't part of antinatalism, which is completely fine. But antinatalism is about moral agents not bringing moral patients into existence, if that makes sense. So
it's not just the view that it's harmful to come into existence, but a further view that it's also wrong to bring beings into existence. And I think there are a range of arguments for this position. Some of them I characterize as philanthropic arguments, and others I think are misanthropic arguments. And here, of course, I'm restricting the scope to bringing human beings into existence, although I think that parallel points might be able to be made about other sentient beings. The original arguments that are advanced are the philanthropic ones, and those really are concerned about the being that you'll bring into existence. And my view is not only that it's always a harm for that being, but that it's also a very serious harm. And given the seriousness of that harm, I think that it's always going to be wrong to create a new being. More recently, I've developed some misanthropic arguments, and those have to do with the harm that the being you bring into existence will do to others. And by others, I mean other human beings, but also other sentient beings on the planet. And so those are two broad kinds of argument. And although one's philanthropic and the other is misanthropic, I don't think that these two are incompatible with one another.
So just to revisit a few of those utterances, lest they blow by and their significance be lost on some of the audience here. So one of the consequences of your view is that it really is a monstrous crime to have children. At a minimum, it's a colossal act of negligence on the part of people who haven't really thought about these issues clearly enough. And I mean, it's kind of analogous on your view to ushering souls into hell, because existence is either that bad or there's a high enough probability that it will be that bad.
Personally, I wouldn't use that imagery of hell, because I think when people think of hell, they usually, they're thinking of like a lake of fire and the devil like fucking, I don't know, hitting you over the head with some shit. And obviously, generally, life isn't that bad. Obviously, you could make an argument that for some beings, it actually is that bad. You probably say that animals in factory farms, that is probably quite accurate to describe it as a hell. There are probably some humans where you could say that their life is a hell. Maybe they're born with some really bad condition, or maybe they're like born into a war zone or something like that. But yeah, I wouldn't use the imagery of hell, because when people compare the imagery of hell to how most people view their own lives, there's such a wide difference there that it makes people think that the antinatalist position rests on your life being hell, which it doesn't. And so people are like, that's hell, that's what antinatalism is kind of resting on. My life isn't like that, so I don't really have to take it seriously. If you get what I mean. I don't think that's a logical way to think, but I think that's, if you use the imagery of hell, that's maybe, it's going to give some people a get-out clause to not really take the argument seriously. So yeah, I wouldn't really use that imagery for like the average life.
That it's just irresponsible to consign people to the fate of existing.
That's correct. Of course, hell comes in degrees. So as bad as it is, it can always be worse. And so we need to be careful about that analogy of ushering somebody into hell, but it's a kind of hell.
I love this topic, and I think this will be fun to get into the details here and hear some more of your specific arguments. But what has been your experience promulgating this idea or set of ideas? I can imagine the thesis provokes anger in some people.
That's for sure. A lot of angry people. Fortunately, not too many of those have made direct contact with me, but one does see a lot of hate mail of a certain kind, and of course a lot of hate comments on the web. But the people who've contacted me tend to be those who have been more sympathetic to my views. And one very common kind of response I've received is from people who've had these sorts of thoughts and felt that they were entirely alone in the world. They thought that they were the only people who thought this, and they've drawn a measure of comfort from knowing that there are others who share that idea.
One distinction to make here is between pessimism of the sort that you're expressing and nihilism. Your view really isn't nihilistic. Do you want to tease those apart?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Many people, I think, mischaracterize the position.
I just very quickly want to say just in the chat, I see people are talking about veganism, which is obviously all cool, but please, people, don't pick on each other. I see that someone is vegetarian. Obviously, whilst I also think that they should be vegan and would encourage them to become vegan, please don't pick on people, because if nothing else, it's just not going to encourage people to become vegan. Probably, it's just going to push them away. So yeah. Yeah, in fact, yeah, Vegan Ganger 96, don't push people around in the chat. Even if you disagree with them, be cordial with people.
As a nihilistic position, and I'm not a nihilist. I think that suffering, for example, is bad, and that's one of the reasons why I think it's wrong to bring new beings into existence, because they're going to suffer, and they're going to suffer pretty unspeakably.
Nihilism here would be that basically nothing matters, right? In the scheme of things, good and bad are just things we make up, and the universe doesn't care about us, and therefore it doesn't really matter if conscious minds get ground up in some inferno interminably. That's not your view at all. You want to avoid the inferno, and you want to avoid committing the moral wrong of consigning people to it.
That's exactly right. Look, I am a nihilist of some kind. So if you ask me about whether our lives have cosmic meaning, I'm a nihilist about that. I don't think that they do. But I just don't think that it follows from that it's okay to inflict suffering on others.
I can imagine that people also try to psychologize you. They must think that this view is really not so much the product of a valid chain of reasoning, it's the product of a likely mood disorder. Are you depressed? Is that a diagnosis you must get hurled at you?
Interestingly, I've had that a bit, but it actually isn't that. So usually when people bring up if you're depressed or you've had a bad childhood or something like that, it's usually people they don't make an accusation. It's more of just like a question, I think. Which, I mean, maybe they're asking the question because they assume that you are or you have had a bad childhood or something like that. But yeah, I haven't tended to have that as an accusation, like people just saying you must be depressed or you obviously had a bad childhood. It has happened, but generally, I think, yeah, I just have found that it's not the first thing that people generally tend to go to.
Yeah, there are lots of people who do exactly that. They try to psychologize it. And I think that's exactly the wrong attitude to have. I think one should look at the arguments, examine them on their merits, and see whether they stand or fall.
But I guess that both things could be true. I mean, I find the arguments very interesting, and we will definitely get into those. But when I heard about you and your emphasis on this position, I did think that your just experience of the world moment to moment, and that would include your mood and everything else about you that can be brought to bear on experience, must be coloring the arguments, or could be coloring your sense of their veracity or moral import. And
so one thing that's kind of related to what Sam Harris is saying here, and it's kind of relevant to a video I'm working on at the moment, is I think maybe what he's suggesting here, because obviously he's deep into Buddhism, meditation, focusing on the moment, this sort of stuff. And obviously one of the things that Buddhists say and Buddhist practice is about is saying much of the suffering that we as humans experience is actually self-generated from constant either attachments to things or constantly mulling things over in our head, replaying things, constantly thinking about the past, constantly thinking about the future, all this sort of stuff. I think Schopenhauer made the observation of as humans, we suffer every harm 3 times. The expectation of it in the future, the experience of it in the present, and then the remembrance of it in the past. Which I think, I think that I mean, I think he says that only humans could do that. I think also some other animals can do that as well. So I think he was kind of like a bit anthropocentric there. And yeah, that's true. I wouldn't say all of the harms of life are like that, but I can get the point that like Sam Harris and maybe other Buddhists would say, you know, well, your pessimistic evaluation of life wouldn't be as bad if you were actually following our practices, because you wouldn't be generating this suffering for yourself, this like gratuitous suffering on yourself. And so your quality of life would actually be better. And whilst I agree with that, the first thing is, I only think that like saying that is only relevant to someone who already exists, someone who needs to mitigate their suffering, right? It wouldn't make sense to create someone and say, well, they can practice Buddhist practice to mitigate the suffering that they would have otherwise imposed on themselves, because you've created them to suffer, to then need to mitigate it, if you get what I mean. And also, I think it's one of those things where it's like you can say something and it's true, but most people in reality aren't going to put it into practice. And so it just doesn't land as well as you think it would. So if I were to say to people, if someone were to say to antinatalists, well, actually, your point isn't as valid as you think, because if you follow Buddhist practice, then lives are going to be not as bad as they are. So it's maybe like slightly less bad, or it's better to bring people into existence with Buddhist practice. But the fact of the matter is, the vast majority of people being brought into existence are not following Buddhist practice. And that's just humans. Most beings brought into existence are non-human animals, and they don't even have the concept of Buddhism. So they can't do that. So I feel like, yeah, it's relevant once you're here and you have the capacities to do that. Like, if you want to follow Buddhist practice, do that. It could reduce your suffering. But this is not like a silver bullet, if you get what I mean.
I guess I'll tell you about an experience I had, and I'm just wondering if there's anything about it that could be relevant to your case. So I had a friend, not a close friend, but someone who I had met many, many times, and this was a person who would email me periodically, who was suicidal, and he had been suicidal for quite some time. At one point, he sent an email to everyone in his life saying, I'm going to commit suicide, and here's your last chance to talk me out of it. Put that way, it sounds like a kind of macabre and gratuitous appeal for attention, but it was more, he was actually just being scrupulous to not kill himself so impulsively that he would leave everyone in his life feeling like, if only they had known, they might have been able to do something. So he was going to give everyone in his life a chance to reason with him. And it was kind of a piece with the reasons why he thought he was killing himself. He really thought he had reasoned himself to a position where suicide was not only acceptable, but was really his best decision. And, he had a very he wasn't a professional philosopher, but he had a very philosophical cast of mind, and he was quite smart. And, I went back and forth with him a little bit over email mostly. And the experience was one of seeing someone, in my view, mistake his anhedonia, his lack of joy in living moment to moment, for a kind of philosophical epiphany. Which is to say, if he felt better, if he was feeling more joy, if he was feeling more of a connection to other people, he would have felt that the results of his reasoning on each of those points were less compelling. And I know your argument is not an argument for suicide. I mean, we'll differentiate antinatalism from that. But I'm just wondering if you feel that if the character of your experience were significantly better moment to moment, if you feel like this philosophical conviction would just kind of evaporate or become so uninteresting to you that it would sort of evaporate.
Well, I don't like to talk about myself, so I'm probably just not going to answer that question. But I'll make a few observations. And one is that one ought not to make the assumption that somebody who holds the sort of view that I do is thinking about themselves. They may be thinking about themselves as well, but they might be just thinking about everything they see around them in the world. So just if you think about the amount of suffering that's going on in the world at any moment, you have to be pretty coarse and callous to not take that seriously. So it needn't be about one's own experiences. It needn't be about one's own attitudes. It might be sort of sensitivity or an expression of what's going on in the world. So you sort of gave an example that's very self-oriented. And what I'm suggesting is that's not the only possible way of looking at things. It's also possible to arrive at these sorts of views by looking outward and looking and seeing what you see around you.
Yeah, no doubt. No doubt.
And then, of course, the other point is that you spoke about him being anhedonic, but
it would also just be interesting, because I know this is kind of off the topic of antinatalism, because he's talking about his friend who, is thinking of ending their life. But it would just be like interesting rather than like psychologizing the person, although it may be a valid point that like Sam Harris is making. It would just be interesting if like Sam Harris had said, what are the arguments that the guy made? Because he kind of said that the guy had convinced himself philosophically that was the best thing to do. So it kind of be like interest. I mean, maybe Sam didn't want to share those because he thought maybe other people would find it convincing. But yeah, rather than getting into the person's psychology, it'd just be more interesting to hear like what were the actual guy's reasons to see if they, to see what they were like.
There are plenty of manic people out there, and their views might be coloured by their mania.
And also, maybe this is what Benatar is about to make in his point, but it also goes the other way, right? Like, we only tend to psychologize people when they're feeling awful, and it results in them maybe wanting to end their life. We never psychologize people when they're like overly optimistic or feeling really good and then using their own experience to create a worldview, right? No one ever. So you hear people say all the time, if you're an antinatalist, or maybe not all the time, but you hear people say, if you're an antinatalist, maybe this philosophy is just a result of like being depressed or depressive thinking or having a dark view of the world. But you never hear the you never hear the opposite thing of like, oh, well, being a pro-natalist or wanting to bring children into the world, this is just a result of these people being like, way too optimistic and, overly like focusing on their own lives. They've clearly had a good life, but you can't extrapolate from your own experience, even though it's been so good, that this, can inform a view on procreation. But people say that all the time, the other view. They say, oh, well, you're depressed, you can't use your experience, though it's been bad, of your own life to extrapolate a general view of procreation. Why do we have an asymmetry here? Surely there should be, you can be delusionally pessimistic and delusionally optimistic, but you never hear people say the optimistic side. You never hear people psychologize that. And I would actually say that is causing more harm, because if people have these rose-tinted glasses on about life, it's going to lead at least if someone is like depressed and has become an antinatalist, they're not creating anyone else to suffer. Even if you think that was a dumb conclusion to come to, it's practically resulted in them just not procreating. So it's not like they've created someone who's going to be harmed in some way. There's a lack of action there. But with like someone who would be like, extremely happy and all this sort of stuff, and it clouds their judgment, and they don't think, rationally, they have a child, that mindset has probably caused more suffering, because they're creating someone who, despite this person's worldview, despite their best intentions, this person can fall victim to all of the potential harms in life that their parent doesn't have control over. Even if the parent does have control over, the parent might just be incompetent. And that just never seems to be scrutinized. It's always like the antinatalist view or the more pessimistic view that gets scrutinized. And I think that's probably because obviously we've evolved to be, I don't know how I guess you would just call it like life-loving, very pro-natalist, very optimistic in this, on this topic. Otherwise, obviously, we wouldn't have evolved that trait. Obviously, you're going to evolve a trait which makes you reproduce more. Cool.
Maybe deriving too much pleasure to actually see the world for what it is.
Yeah. It's hard to know what is normal here, or what is a uncolored lens through which to look at these questions. And there may, in fact, be no uncolored lens. It may just be lenses all the way in. So let's get into the details of your argument. Run through the asymmetry argument for me.
So there's actually more than one asymmetry argument, but there is a kind of axiological asymmetry, I think, between benefits and harms, between the good things and the bad things. And obviously, if we're speaking within a life, the pains that you have, the other harms that you have, these are bad.
Just before, let me just quickly go back a bit. Oh, I think I went back too far. I was just going to say, just before Benatar goes into his whole spiel, just see if there's anyone new in the chat to say welcome to. So, Chow, I don't know if I've said that right, actually. Another name I can't pronounce, but welcome. Tailgate Activism, MJ, Jimmy M Experience, New York City. I don't think I said hello to you. Maybe I did. Olawali Blue Vegan, welcome. HT, welcome. Cool. Okay, nice one. Cool. And apologies, I haven't really been keeping up with the chat the past few minutes, so I don't entirely know what's going on. But let's continue.
What it is.
Yeah, it's hard to know what is normal here or what is a uncolored lens through which to look at these questions. And there may, in fact, be...
Ultimately, I don't think there is an uncolored lens when it comes to this topic, because, I mean, there's no uncolored lens when it comes to morality generally, right? Because morality isn't, fundamentally, it's not like an empirical thing. It's not something like you can study the world and say, you know, X, Y, Z, blah, 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 this is what we should think. Like, you have to have values that underlie that, right? And yeah, we all have values. We'll have varying values. People will have differing values. So it's like, yeah, when you're having a moral discussion, the lenses are always going to be colored because it's a value-based discussion you're having. And some people are just going to have naturally different values to others. Their values might change. Like people might be able to convince you and change your intuitions and change what you value and stuff. Like that's happened to me, you know. But that just means that the coloring of your lens has changed. It doesn't mean that you don't have any more color in your lens. It just means the coloring has changed. So yeah, I don't think there is a way to have an uncolored lens when it comes to morality. Everyone has their biases, their values, their you know, base intuitions, all of this sort of stuff. Which why often these conversations are so hard, because sometimes you get right down to the bottom and you're just different from the other person, and it's extremely hard to change someone's base values.
No uncolored lens. It may just be lenses all the way in. So let's get into the details of your argument. Run through the asymmetry argument for me.
So there's actually more than one asymmetry argument, but there is a kind of axiological asymmetry, I think, between benefits and harms, between the good things and the bad things. And obviously, if we're speaking within a life, the pains that you have, the other harms that you have, these are bad. And the good things that you have, those are good. But if we're considering the scenario in which somebody is going to be brought into existence, we have to compare the outcome in which they do from the outcome in which they don't exist. And when in the outcome in which they don't exist, we have to consider the absent harms and the absent benefits. And I think that the absence of the harms is good, even though that person won't exist. Whereas the absence of the good things in that life is not going to be bad. And that's because there's going to be nobody who's going to be deprived of those good things.
Yeah, so for example, if you take like a practical example or whatever, like let's say like, you know, this is like a very common example, at least in my experience. So like whenever I've been doing like animal rights outreach and stuff, and you speak to you know, you're speaking to someone on the street and you say, you know, look at the you know, these animals, they're being exploited. Or you could even say this about, you know, like a human in, you know, like maybe a child labor or whatever in you know, digging for cobalt or something. And So yeah, if you're doing outreach and you say to them like, yeah, look at these animals, the clear moral issue, like we shouldn't be breeding these animals, and the person says to you, well then they wouldn't exist at all. And the common response is like, yeah, good. It's better. It's a good thing that they don't come into existence to suffer all this stuff. That's what Benatar is saying here. He's saying the absence of those harms, like if a pig is brought into a farm, the absence of those harms, even though the pig doesn't exist to be actively benefiting from those harms, it's a good thing that those harms have not been brought into existence. And then he covered the opposite, didn't he? So the opposite would be, if you have a completely different situation where there's a pig in it, like potentially in a sanctuary. You've got a sanctuary. This sanctuary can facilitate really nice lives. And you can have the same with a child. You can facilitate a really nice life. If you fail to create, let's say you fail to create a child, or you don't bring the male and the female pigs together so they don't breed amongst themselves, it's not bad that they are not coming into existence to experience the positive things they would have experienced, because they simply just don't exist to be deprived of those. And that's the asymmetries explained there with examples. And now I think he's going to go on to explain further.
And so the asymmetry is really between the bad and the good in the scenario in which somebody doesn't exist.
Okay, so...
Yeah, so just to be clear, there's an example when someone exists. If someone already exists, then the goods and the bads would be symmetrical. The asymmetry only kicks in if you're considering a being who never exists, right? Who doesn't come into existence or doesn't exist. So that is the case for obviously any potential child that someone's thinking of creating. At the point that they're having that conversation, making that judgment, obviously that kid doesn't exist. So that's where the asymmetry kicks in.
It strikes me, I kind of want to run through each piece of that again so that to make sure that I'm not making a mistake here in reasoning, but it strikes me that there's kind of an imbalance here in how you're presenting that, and you could be conjuring the asymmetry in a way. So you're saying, and just point out where I go wrong here, you're saying that the absence of a good life can't be a harm because there's no one who is harmed. There's no person who is deprived of this life. So the absence of goods is not a bad thing, but the absence of a bad life is a good. Here, in my view, you're kind of smuggling the absence of existence in as part of the good. You're saying that the prevention of harm is a positive good, even though there is no one who enjoys this absence of harm. Is that where you're kind of putting the rabbit in the hat?
Well, a lot of people have suggested that I'm doing that, but the point I'm making here is not so much a metaphysical one as I say, an axiological one. It's about an asymmetry of values between the good things and the bad things in life. And one of the reasons why I think, first of all, I think this asymmetry is actually pretty intuitive, and I think large numbers of people would accept it until they see where it leads. But this basic asymmetry, I think, explains some other asymmetries that many people would endorse. So here's an example. There are large parts of the universe that are uninhabited. There aren't beings there, certainly not sentient beings. And if we think about those uninhabited parts of the universe, we're not filled with, and nor do I think we should be filled with remorse for the absent goods that there are there. So if we think about Mars, for example, where there could be Martians, but they aren't, we don't think, think about all that pleasure that those absent Martians could have. Isn't that a terrible thing? We don't think that at all. Whereas, if we think about the absence of, let's say, Martian wars, just like we have wars on Earth, and we think about the absence of all the suffering there, I think we say that's a pretty good thing. It's pretty good that they don't have that there, that there's nothing like that on Mars. That's an advantage that Mars has over Earth.
But there's no one who doesn't have those harms.
Exactly. But I still think that it's a good thing that there's the absence of that suffering on Mars.
Now, I'll grant you that there are many other possible asymmetries.
Yeah, just like, if you get told, if a couple has a screening and they have a hereditary disease, and they know that if they have a kid, it's like 95% chance that kid is going to get that disease and they're going to have a horrible life, and they decide as a result not to have that child, even though the child doesn't exist to be actively benefiting from that decision, it's still a good thing that they didn't bring that child into existence. I wouldn't say that it's just a neutral thing, it's neither here nor there. No, it's a good thing they didn't bring that child into existence, because that would have been a very bad thing to do.
Symmetries here that we should be concerned about. So, for instance, one thing you claim, or at least I think it's implicit in some of your claims, is that there's much more suffering or possible suffering than there is, possible happiness, or the depth of it is far greater. And so there's an asymmetry between suffering and happiness that is also just swings the balance here. So we'll talk about that. But here I feel like you're running afoul of my intuitions here. So, and what you just said about the moral significance of canceling possible goods definitely stands in opposition to the work of every philosopher who is working on what is called existential risk now. So you can have philosophers like, Will MacAskill, who...
Yeah, but it's kind of like there's a bias there, right? Like, you would expect a disproportionate amount of the people working on existential risk to be those who want there to be a far-flung future and think it's good to bring people into existence, right? Because they would be more concerned that there may be an extinction, right? Whereas someone who thinks that actually it's not necessarily a good thing to continue the human species, whilst they obviously won't be a fan of the suffering that will happen through while extinction is occurring, they wouldn't necessarily have the same motivations behind them of having this far-flung future. So they might just focus to do other things with their time. So you wouldn't, you would kind of expect the people working on existential risk to be those people. You would, more pro-natalist people. You would maybe expect more antinatalist people to work on S risks, suffering risks. That would make sense, because if a concern about suffering risks, a far-flung future, is not necessarily really relevant to that, or only in the fact that actually you maybe wouldn't want a far-flung future if you were concerned about S risks, because then there are more beings that will be in existence to potentially suffer from those S risks. I don't think that's a hard and fast division, but yeah, I'm just pushing back a bit on what Sam was saying. I don't think the fact that you would just expect more pro-natalist people to be in the existential risk sector.
We'll say that the greatest possible wrong would be to do something which put our species on track for, self-annihilation. And that would be, in large measure, not because of all the suffering that would be caused, because, if we're annihilated in the right way, it could be completely painless. It would be wrong because it would close the door to all of the untold goods that could come from 1 billion years of creative involvement with the cosmos. If you knew that there was some decision you took today that not only deprived your grandchildren from living the most glorious possible life, they just had sort of glorious life, but you deprived all of their descendants.
I've just put the playback speed up because it's quite a long interview.
From even existing and discovering greater depths of beauty. People are persuaded, and I'm one of them, that those hypothetical losses are as real as the hypothetical gain of not suffering if you don't exist.
So I think that when we think about human extinction, there's something that clouds people's thinking. And that's why the moment you think about the application of this asymmetry to human extinction, all these other intuitions of the kind of depriving come up. That's why the example I gave wasn't about human extinction. It was a case of some other species, let's say on another planet, that could have been there and isn't there. And we don't spend any time worrying about that, nor do I think we should spend any time worrying about the absent pleasures over there. When we think about human extinction, there are some confounding variables. The one is the mechanism whereby the extinction takes place. So there's a distinction between whether people sort of die out or whether they're killed off. And so one way in which we could go extinct is through people meeting an untimely end and being killed. But another way is for everybody to die peacefully in their beds and for the human species to have come to an end because there was no more reproduction. And I think a lot of what's going on with people's intuitions is a mixing up of those things. And then I think there's a lot of sentimentality about the human species. There's this idea that it's a wonderful species and we'd like it to be around for a long time, and haven't we discovered and done all sorts of wonderful things, and wouldn't it be good if that whole trajectory of scientific discovery went on, and there's kind of sentimentality about having humans around. And so I think that those sorts of factors confound our thinking about cases of human extinction. So I would like to move away from those to think of the application of the asymmetry to other cases and see how it works.
Granted, some people might be confounded. I don't think I am here. In fact, I think there are a few more things to say about just canceling the human career that are relevant here. But before we do, I just want to linger on this, what strikes me as a kind of an asymmetry that is giving you your first asymmetry here, which is you're accruing a good to non-existent beings on one side of your equation where you're not on the other. Do you not see it that way, or you just think it's justified?
No, I do see it that way, but I think it's justified. There is this axiological asymmetry, and I think when you do the calculations that follow from that, the cards are stacked against bringing somebody into existence, but it's not an artificial stacking. It's one that makes eminent sense.
I guess it's still not making sense to me, so let's just spend a few more minutes on this. So we have a person who could have existed but doesn't, and undoubtedly there are philosophical problems with thinking about possibility as well. I mean, are there these possible things, or are there simply actual things, and we're actually just misled by our notion of possibility? But leaving that aside, I have two children, which already convicts me of a monstrous ethical lapse on your account, but we'll leave that aside. But I have decided not to have a third child, you'll be happy to know. So this third child will not experience anything good or anything bad. And on your account, there's no deprivation to him or her for not being brought into existence on account of not getting to do all the good things there are to do. But there is a benefit to not suffering all of the inevitable pains of existence. But that benefit doesn't accrue to anyone, because no one by this description exists.
That's correct. And it's impossible, of course, if a person doesn't exist, for them to enjoy the benefit. But when we're looking at scenarios of bringing somebody into existence or not, we're having to compare those two cases, one scenario in which they do exist and one in which they don't. And if we want to know what's better for that potential person, we need to compare the situation in which they do and the situation in which they don't. And we have to compare, obviously, the scenario in which they don't exist to the one in which they do, and make the interest judgments relative to the world in which the person does exist.
How would this calculation run for you if existence was on balance more pleasant and wonderful and creative and beautiful, so that every person who comes into existence runs a better than even chance of having a life worth living? But still, there are many lives that are not worth living, and they come up quite frequently. They just don't overwhelm the lives that are worth living. Then how would you think about it?
Well, that very phrase, a life worth living, I think is ambiguous.
We have just had a super chat from Tailgate Activism. Thank you so much for the support, and it's much appreciated. And Tailgate Activism has left a message. They ask, do you know any antinatalists in the United States that are willing to give their time to participate in active outreach with me? I don't know any vegan antinatalists.
We bring
got
children
it coming
into this
through on the
world,
stream.
and we raise them
To
to
be
be
warriors
warriors against evil.
So the first thing is that, there are quite a few antinatalists in the US that are willing to give their time to do outreach. In the first part, you say antinatalist, and then the second part, you say vegan antinatalist. So I don't know if you're specifically wanting to do it with vegan antinatalists, but I'm pretty sure that basically all the antinatalists I'm aware of doing activism in the US are vegan as well. So that shouldn't be an issue. But Stop Having Kids, obviously. So Dietz runs that. There's a range of people involved with that. I know Nick, who also goes by the name Noodles or Vegan Equilibrium. If you type in Vegan Equilibrium on YouTube, his channel should come up. There should be a way to get in contact with him. He does activism pretty regularly. You can ask him and he can probably hook you up. Just contact Stop Having Kids. They do it very regularly.
And we raise them to be warriors against evil.
Thank you so much for the donation. This one came through Streamlabs. And hang on, let me just bring it back onto me. Thank you so much for the donation. This person says, I'm really enjoying the stream so far. A debate with David Benatar is always entertaining. well, you will enjoy the panel coming up then whenever it's released in the next couple of days. It's not a debate. There is some back and forth between people, but it's not really a debate. It's more a discussion, and like a panel discussion. So look forward to that. And obviously, he's got his new book coming out as well. So you can pre-order that now, and everyone can look forward to that. But thank you so much. Cool. Okay. Yeah. I'm just thinking if there's anyone else I can think of about tailgate activism. There's also Ash Wickety. I also know. I mean, I don't know if she's done any activism recently, but I know she did used to do Stop Having Kids. I've had her on the channel a couple of times. But yeah, there's a range of people. If you reach out to Stop Having Kids, they should. I don't know where in the US you are, but they should either be like, they could come to your area, or they may be able to link you up with people. But I don't think you would necessarily struggle an insane amount to find people, especially if you're willing to travel, or you find people that are willing to travel to you. But I don't know where you are. I'm fucking not on the right thing, am I? There we go.
And I think it's ambiguous between...
So just in case people have forgotten, Benatar is talking about the difference between starting a life and continuing one. Before we go into that, we have another super chat. Thank you so much for the support. This one is from Viganja. I'm not sure if I'm saying that right, 96. And they say, watch Colin Farrell's American actor, Colin Farrell's new video about his son with Angelman syndrome. I saw that a video had come out. I didn't realize it was a recent one. I had it suggested to me on YouTube, but
children in this world,
let's just wait for them.
We raise them to be warriors against evil.
Yeah, I hadn't watched it because I don't know, I just had no particular motivation to watch it. I thought maybe it's just I don't know, some weird celebrity situation and stuff, and I didn't realize it was a recent thing as well. So yeah, I will go and watch that at some point, because it has been recommended to me by YouTube. But yeah, so to finish off, he says he feels guilty for having him and forcing him into existence. Oh, really? That's interesting. Okay, well, I'll definitely check that out. In fact, I'll get it on my phone and add it to watch later now. Right, yeah, it was only from 11 days ago. Okay, cool. Cool. Okay, yeah, thank you for the recommendation. Cool. Okay, let's continue.
A life worth starting and a life worth continuing. And I think one mistake people make is to not see that ambiguity, because I think different standards ought to apply to those two cases. So if at a given time there's more good in your life than bad, then your life may indeed be worth continuing. I say may indeed because there's some complexities there that we could revisit later. But I think the bar for starting a life is going to be much higher.
Let's stick with the starting of life, because we'll get on to whether life is worth continuing. Let's just say that we lived in a world where at birth, every human being could expect to have a slightly better than even chance. I mean, basically, they're like the house in a casino playing blackjack, right? They have whatever it is, a 52% chance of winning. And winning, in this case, really is winning, right? There's no downside to winning. It's just the 52% of people who have good lives on balance really do have good lives on balance any way you look at them. And then, the 48% of people who don't have negative lives to one or another degree. Then how would you think about it?
Well, I think even the lives that are good on balance, there's going to be plenty of bad.
But let's just stipulate that we live in a world that's kind of like a coin toss, and if the right side of the coin comes up, that is a life on balance, however you want to aggregate benefits and injuries.
So I'm not quite understanding the question here, because if the analogy is sort of winning at blackjack, well, when you win, you win. There's no downside to the winning. Whereas when you win in this life lottery that you're speaking about, what I want to get clarity on is there no downside? Is this a life of unmitigated good, or is there some negative as well? And from what you said, I was understanding you ought to be saying that there is some bad as well. It's just that on balance, it's good.
I guess there could be some bad, but it is, in the case of the lucky life, it is outweighed by the good, so that each of your pains are manageable enough that when your pleasure comes around, you always feel that it was worth it. And let's just say that you're right to feel that. We've tuned the luck of lucky minds in such a way that life is really good, and pain does not overwhelm pleasure.
Okay, you see, when you say that you think it's worth it, are you saying it's worth it to have come into existence,
Yeah.
or that it's worth it to continue existing?
I'm, without granting you that distinction, because I'm not sure I agree that exists, but we'll get there. For the purposes of this,
That's pretty crazy that he doesn't think that that distinction exists, because then presumably he would think if he was able to, for example, if Sam Harris had a child that had some sort of, well, actually, let me think. Does that example work? I'm not sure if that example would work, but yeah, I was going to use a specific example, but I actually don't know if it would work or not, so I won't use it. But yeah, so him not thinking that there's a distinction between starting a life and continuing one is pretty, pretty strange. Because when someone exists, like, they are someone who has relationships, like needs, interests, someone who can like suffer in a very real way, someone who can feel pleasure, all of this sort of stuff. Someone who in a very real way like commands like respect and has moral value and all these things. And he's saying that that person, like them being able to continue their life, is the same as starting a life that never existed. There is no existing person there who has any of the things that that existing person has. And he's saying there's no difference between those two cases. That seems pretty crazy. So like if you're able to, I don't know if this would carry, but I'll use the example and people can accept it for themselves or reject it for themselves. But I'm not sure if this would carry. So presumably in his view then, if you were able to bestow some benefit to someone or alleviate some harm, which I guess would be a benefit, like he doesn't think there's a difference between providing that to the person who already exists or creating someone for them to then have it. So if he has someone with a hereditary disease, like if one of his children had a hereditary disease and he had the medicine to be able to cure it, and he knew that if he had another child, they would also have the hereditary disease, there would be no difference in his view giving the medicine to the existing child or creating a third child and giving them the medicine to then cure their hereditary disease that will be created once they're created. That seems pretty wild to me. I'm not sure if that would carry through, because in one instance you wouldn't have someone left over with a hereditary disease, and the other one you would. But it's just the fact that, like, I guess that the wild thing is that he thinks there's an equivalent good thing being done in helping someone alleviate hereditary disease who already exists and is in need of that, and creating someone with a hereditary disease and then helping them cure it. And he's saying that's a good thing to help, like to create them and help them cure it there. Not like ignoring the fact that they didn't exist. They didn't exist before. Sorry, I'm using a massage ball on the floor for my foot while we're doing this stream, and it rolled away. Yeah, I kind of lost where I was, but the fact that he sees that as good is pretty wild, because like he's the one who's imposing the hereditary disease on the kid in the first place, and obviously he's already imposed it on the kid who already exists, but like that kid does now exist, and so obviously it's a good thing to provide them with that cure. But yeah.
Point in the conversation, I'm talking about coming into existence. So you don't exist, and I give you the opportunity to exist. And if you were one of the lucky ones, you would find yourself in a circumstance.
The fact he frames it as giving you the opportunity to exist, that's so crazy.
That was well worth your time.
Well, that I think is a confusion. I grant you that there are many people who say, I'm glad I was brought into existence because I think on balance it's better that I'm around. I think I'm getting more good than I am getting bad. But I just think that people who hold that view have not thought carefully enough about what the question is. I think that because they already exist, they're biased towards the condition in which they already exist. And so what they're actually...
Yeah, and they're thinking about life from the point of view of someone who exists. They're not thinking genuinely from the position. They're not thinking genuinely about the case where someone never exists, because they're making this judgment while they themselves are already emotionally attached to all the things that not creating someone would mean that a new person wouldn't experience. And they're sort of simulating a deprivation in their head for the person who would never exist. But because they would never exist, that deprivation actually wouldn't exist.
Asking themselves without realizing it is my life worth continuing? But I don't think there's any life that's worth starting. And I think there's no life that's worth starting because of this asymmetry.
Surely you would grant that if existence were much, much better than it is in fact, you could imagine a life worth living, right? I mean, what if existence just had no suffering at all in it, right? It was just one leap from creative height to another, and every moment was more interesting than the last.
So I've considered that possibility, and I think in that scenario we should be indifferent between coming into existence and not. But I've got to say that scenario you've imagined is actually pretty hard to imagine in practice. Hard to imagine any real such life. But yes, if you're thinking about hypothetically, a hypothetical life where you come into existence and there's nothing bad about that, then I would say I'd be indifferent between that. I think we should be indifferent between coming into existence in that condition and not coming into existence at all.
That is a novel view that I have never considered. I'm wondering whether to focus there for a moment before going on to capture some of these loose threads. Let's spend a moment on that. If I posit a kind of godlike paradise for all conscious beings, right? So there really is there's nothing wrong in the universe by anything that you can say is wrong. Like there's a little ache and pain over here, there's a little dissatisfaction over here. I will just cancel that by saying, no, those are moments where there's more pleasure flooding in there, and more, an even deeper sense of meaning, even deeper gratification of one's intellectual life. And these are beings who are far more competent than you and I are to judge the character of their experience. They've had 1 billion years to consider the matter, and they're still happy to be here. Imagine minds constituted like that. Why should we be indifferent to that and the primordial dial tone of not existing?
See, I think what's dividing us here is the asymmetry. Because if you think there is the asymmetry that I'm defending, then you'll say, well, there's nothing bad in that Edenic life that you're speaking about, but there's also nothing bad in the situation of non-existence. So they're equal. Now you'll say, but in Eden there are all these pleasures, and I say that's great, because if you're in Eden, it's good that you have those pleasures, because your life would be worse without them. But if you've never existed, the absence of those pleasures is going to mean nothing to you. You won't be there. You won't care about it. It doesn't matter that there's not a being that's having those pleasures. So you think about, I don't know, Adam and Eve, and then some third character that could have been there. This is before the fall, obviously, and you say, is it a pity that there's not some additional being here that's not enjoying Eden? No, I don't think there's anything bad about that. And I think there's an indifference. And there should be an indifference.
I can see that there's nothing bad about it because there's no one to suffer the absence of those pleasures and insights. But again, by the same token, I'm not convinced that you can make the other move you're making, which is to say that there's something good about not having the suffering imposed on you if you don't exist. If you don't exist, you can't feel the relief of not being tortured because you don't exist. So I feel like there's a symmetry there of just non-being.
Let's come back to your third possible child. Let's imagine you were thinking about having a third child, and you did some genetic tests, and you found out that this child that you could have would lead a life that, even by your standards, is one of great suffering. And so you decide, well, we're not going to go ahead with this third child. We're not going to have this third child. Do you think that would be a good thing?
Yes.
And do you think you've got a reason to avoid bringing that child into existence?
But the reason is one which is predicated on the existence of the child, and therefore the existence of his or her suffering. We're talking here about the absence of a wrong that I'm not committing by bringing this guaranteed to suffer person into existence.
So you're imagining some scenario in which this child does exist and is leading a life of suffering, and you say, well, I've got a reason to avoid that.
Right.
Now, let's imagine that you're thinking of having this third child, and you do the tests and everything's fine. And so it could turn out like your other children are. And I don't know your children. I hope they're doing well as can be. But let's imagine they're doing well. And this third child, the probability is that it'll be like that.
Let's just say on their worst afternoons, they'll confirm everything you fear about the nature of existence.
On your children's
yes,
most often.
Yes. Yeah.
Sorry,
They can complain about the most insubstantial things, and you'd be amazed at how much anguish can be provoked by having the television turned off prematurely.
Right. But let's imagine that this third child would lead a happy life by your standards.
Right.
Do you have a reason to bring that child into existence?
Well, let's leave aside all the other reasons that no doubt you've considered, just, their effect on other people, their effect on me, all that. Just localizing the benefit to the person. Yes, I think so. I think that this comes down to population ethics and topics that I hope we'll touch, but there is a kind of more is better principle here when you're talking about good lives. These are all fascinating questions, and they connect to more or less everything that's fascinating. So I'm just trying to resist the slide into philosophy here. But it seems to me that much of what you're saying about bringing people into existence does in fact apply to the continuing existence of existing people. I know you draw a clear line of demarcation there. I'm not so sure you can, and I think this is an additional problem for me here. So how is it not analogous for me to say, well, I have a child, and there was something very, very good that could have happened to her. I could have secured some benefit for her that she doesn't know about, but I declined to do that, right? So she has the life she has, but I could have given her the super enhanced life with really very little effort on my part.
You're talking about an existing child here.
An existing child. But I declined to do that. So now she has her life as it was and was going to be, but it could have been otherwise. And I, for quite capricious reasons of my own, because I didn't want to spend 10 seconds to sign a form or click a button on a website, she does not have this extraordinarily positive thing happen for her. And she doesn't know about it, right? So has she been wronged in any way? And I think most people's intuitions would be yes. And yet on your account, I'm wondering if I could say that.
Well, we're talking about a case of an existing child here, and I think there are all kinds of other complexities about this case. Whether she had some entitlement to your bestowing this benefit, there are all kinds of questions of that kind. But you are speaking about an existing child, and so I would say that this child is worse off without this benefit having been bestowed. So whether you've wronged her is another question, but she's worse off than she would have been.
Yeah, because she's an existing person with an interest in an improved standard of living and improved quality of life, which presumably this benefit would facilitate. And so, yeah, there's an existing interest there that can be attended to. There's a deprivation if that's not being fulfilled. So, yeah, like Benatar said, whether you go as far as to say you're wronging the person, but there's definitely something morally relevant there. And that's just not the case with creating someone. If you don't create someone, there is no interest in anything that is in any sort of relation with the action that you've just decided not to take.
If you bestow this benefit. But I don't think that a parallel claim can be made about a child that you don't bring into existence. Although if it had come into existence, it would have had certain benefits. I think the absence of those benefits, because it doesn't come into existence, is not bad. And it's not bad because it's not deprived. Whereas your existing child will be deprived of this benefit you could have given.
Another point of confusion for me here is that you acknowledge a spectrum of experience ranging from the very, very positive to the very, very negative. But when you take the 0 point of non-existence, you say that we should be indifferent between 0 and the very, very positive. Whereas we shouldn't be indifferent between 0 and the very, very negative. The very, very negative is worse, obviously, and we should avoid it. And we should choose 0 every time over the very, very negative. But we should be indifferent to 0 over the very, very positive. But I'm not quite sure how that would work in practice. So imagine if we're sliding down the ramp of a hedonic experience. We start at the very, very positive, and life gets worse and worse and worse and worse and worse until it gets truly neutral. And maybe there's other forms of neutral beyond the lights going out, but at least one form of neutral is not having any discernible experience. And then we just keep on sliding, and things get a little bit bad and a little bit worse, and all of a sudden we're in hell. It seems to me that if you're going to preserve the logical integrity of that spectrum, you'd have to acknowledge that better really is better than nothing.
See, again, I don't think that it is. This assignment of 0 that you're proposing is something that I've anticipated before. And I've got an analogy to deal with a case. Like, of course, it's only an analogy. It can't be like the case that we're speaking about in every respect. But I imagine these two people. The one is, we call him sick, and the other we call healthy. And sick gets sick, but he's also got some attribute whereby he recovers quickly from his sickness. Healthy never gets sick. I mean, never ever gets sick. But he lacks the attribute of quick recovery. So if H were to get sick, he wouldn't quickly recover. It'd be a very slow recovery. Now, what I want to say about sick is that capacity for quick recovery, that's good, and it's good for sick. But the absence of that capacity in the healthy person is not a net disadvantage over sick, because he never has any need for that.
Right.
And so I think we should say a similar thing about these scenarios about existing and non-existing, and that these absent pleasures are not bad relative to the other scenario. In other words, they're not a net disadvantage in comparison with the scenario in which the person exists. So I want to resist that sort of attribution of, let's say, 0 to the absence of the pleasures or the absence of the good things in life, if they're the absent good things of a non-existent person.
So not all of my intuitions are being conserved here. I mean, I will say here on this point, your view is especially Buddhist, and for people who might be surprised by that, and I don't know how familiar you are with Buddhist philosophy, but I'll just say that on the Buddhist account, existence is the problem. And they have this, obviously, this view of rebirth and karma, and there's what's called a wheel of becoming, life after life. You just can't get off this wheel unless you become fully enlightened. Enlightenment consists in no longer being subjected to this continuous cycle of rebirth. There's obviously very good reason to doubt that picture of existence scientifically, but the core of the ethical view there and the soteriological view, the view of what it means to be free, is that existence has this intrinsically unsatisfying character. And, this is for reasons that we really haven't gone into yet. It's just the fact that everything is impermanent. Your pleasures, no matter how good, always fall away, and you're left with more of a search for pleasure. There's a kind of an intrinsic dissatisfaction, even in satisfaction. It wouldn't be bad if no one existed, and the fact that people exist in a circumstance that is perfect to frustrate the search for happiness and well-being is the problem. And enlightenment is the act of canceling all of the kind of the mental properties that would cause one to continually be reborn into existence. So your view is very Buddhist without offering the methodology of enlightenment, or unless you do that, and I don't know about it.
Or the odd metaphysic of reincarnation.
Exactly, yeah. But there are a few other wrinkles here in Buddhism, and one is that it's possible through a really deep engagement in methods like meditation to come to a kind of equanimity that equalizes pain and pleasure to a remarkable degree, and to find a kind of intrinsic well-being in just the nature of consciousness. And that does make some of the Buddhist view that I just described somewhat paradoxical. I mean, it's not, the problem of existence can really go away to a remarkable degree on the Buddhist account. So that's all just a long way of saying that your view is in very good standing with certain trends in Eastern philosophy, and it just doesn't capture everything they say. But let's take this distinction between the possible lives and the existing lives and their interests, because I'm not so sure you're conserving my intuitions there. Why would it be a bad thing for everyone to die tonight painlessly in their sleep? Let's just picture what this entails. So everyone goes to sleep, none the wiser. They don't know this is their last day on Earth. There's been no dread in anticipation of the lights going out. But everyone, based on some bad luck or good luck, depending on your view, dies painlessly.
So before they get into this, one thing to mention on what Sam Harris is saying is that this can be an interesting ethical question, but it's separate from antinatalism. Often people couple it when they're talking to an antinatalist, and they start asking questions about death, because obviously if you're talking about the start of life, the end of life also comes to mind, because it's birth, death, these things are often coupled together. And if you're talking about one, then the other one is not unlikely to come up in conversation. So I think that's one of the reasons why people's minds go there. Another reason people's minds go there is because obviously you're talking about the bad things in life. But yeah, one thing to say is that whilst discussions on birth and death may share certain facts you're talking about in term that you're referencing, it doesn't mean that having one view on one means you have to have a particular view on the other, if you get what I mean. So if the fact that when you're having a discussion about antinatalism, you're referencing the quality of the human condition or the sentient condition, the fact that if you're having a discussion about death, you also reference that quality doesn't mean that having a particular position on death or birth means that you have to have another particular view on the other position on the other one, if you get what I mean. There will be a range of ethical issues where you discuss the same sort of data points, but you're talking about a different issue with respect to those data points. It doesn't necessarily mean you have to have the same, there are what's the term? Default positions you have to have on all these things. So yeah, someone's view on death or suicide is not just going to depend on their antinatalist view. If it at all is influenced by their antinatalist view, there are a whole range of other views that are relevant to this. Does the person believe there's a soul? Do they believe there's an afterlife? How do they view death itself? Do they view it as a harm? All these things are relevant to what Sam Harris is bringing up here, which is it's important to mention that it's it's a multifactorial conversation to have, right? It's not just there's not a direct line from antinatalism to any specific view on death. And I think often, people make an assumption about antinatalist views on death, or they bring that conversation up straight away, not appreciating the fact that actually there's a whole range of things you need to take into consideration, not just like whether someone is an antinatalist or not.
Painlessly in his or her sleep. So there's no bereavement, there's no experience of this. There's just the lights going out in 7 billion brains all at once. What could be wrong with that?
Well, I think that those of us who do exist have an interest in continuing to exist. We've got an interest in not being annihilated. And the scenario you are presenting is one in which we are annihilated.
Why do we have an interest in being reborn tomorrow from the womb of sleep if existence is, as you say, such that bringing people into it is a terrible crime?
It's kind of strange to ask, why do we have an interest in that? Like, sometimes you just can't explain why we have an interest in that. I mean, it could, you know, we presumably just evolved it through through our species life history on this planet, right? Like, it's an odd question to say, why do people, like, if you say, you know, it's a very reasonable thing to say that people have the will to like exist, you know, continue living. It's a very strange thing to say, why do people have that will? Well, who knows? I don't know. It just seems to be innate in us. Everyone seems to have it, or with very few exceptions. It's probably got a lot to do with how we evolved. But he's framing it in a way where, like, maybe Benatar's going to have to come up with some sort of like I don't know if it would be moral reason or non-evolutionary reason. I don't know. Let's see how Benatar replies. I can't remember how he replies, but it just seems like a bit of an odd question to me, because it's like, how is Benatar supposed to know why we have this interest? Like, we don't even understand consciousness yet. So how are we supposed to understand why we have certain interests that originate from our consciousness? It's, you know, it's quite a tough question to ask. Like, how is Benatar supposed to know the answer?
Well, I think the analogy is not correct. I don't think we are reborn. I mean, we're reborn in a metaphorical sense, but not literally. I think there are all kinds of things that are going on in our sleep. We're continuing to exist in a kind of dispositional state. Our interests in continuing to live are surviving through that period of sleep, as are many of our desires and our preferences. And I think if we die in our sleep, one of our interests, a very important interest, at least one, if not many, have been thwarted.
I can't see how we have any more interest than a new being would. Again, you have to imagine just canceling all of the usual problems with people dying, right? They don't know they're going to die, so there's no imposed suffering in advance, and there's no one around to suffer their loss. There's no grief. There's not even a single neuron in a single brain disposed to grieve about what's happened, because no one knows that it will happen and no one's around to know that it has happened. How is that not analogous to someone not coming into existence on the next day?
Because somebody...
But if Sam's making this case, why... I mean, presumably he then believes this, that like shooting someone in their sleep is completely fine. Because if he thinks all these things are true, then shooting someone in your sleep would be ethical, presumably, whether or not you're an antinatalist. Like, to me, there doesn't seem to be a specific reason why you should ask Benatar this. Like, if you have the view that Sam just laid out, independent of whether you're an antinatalist or not, then you, like, Sam seems to be suggesting you'd be okay with shooting people in their sleep. That's what I mean by, the stream seems to be lagging. Hopefully, the stream seems to be lagging a bit. I am going to just change my... I'm going to pull the curtain across to try and reduce the heat on the equipment, because that might be causing it. Okay. Hopefully that has made it better. Yeah, hopefully that has made it better. It seems like it's still lagging. But I think people can still hear me, right? Cool. I don't know where I got to in the discussion. I'm going to... Let's just go back to here so it's just on me for a minute. And let's just wait to see if things come back. Oh, why does technology do this? It doesn't seem to have affected the audio. So I think if I just continue talking, it should be okay. So I'm just going to continue because I think it, like with the audio, it's fine. It's just the visuals are a bit fucked. I'm just going to check the report that's being produced by Streamlabs. Yeah. Okay, cool. Okay. Well, let's continue. And hopefully the video becomes a bit better.
Doesn't exist, I think, has got no interest in coming into existence. But somebody who already exists has got an interest in not ceasing to exist. Now, one thing I should add here is that I think these two views are separable. In other words, the asymmetry argument that I've given before and the argument that I'm giving you now, these are two separate arguments. So it's possible for an antinatalist to also be a pro-mortalist of the kind that you're suggesting. So if somebody thinks that a painless death, or let's say death itself, is not bad for the person who dies, and then we add all the stipulations that you've added, if somebody thinks that, then they'd say there's nothing wrong with the scenario. There's nothing bad about the scenario you've described. But that's a separate view from the asymmetry that I've been presenting. So you can have the asymmetry that I presented earlier, and then you can either couple that with the view I'm offering now about ceasing to exist, or you needn't couple it with that.
That's precisely the point. I don't see how you can keep them apart. If existence has the character that you say that it has, and I would grant you you're on very firm ground thinking that pains are worse than pleasures and that there are more of them, and we can talk about that. But if it really is bad to be brought into the world, and not just a little bad, it's really, really bad, then I don't see how that doesn't extend to the moral character of waking up the next day. And if I can give you a situation where there are no ancillary harms accrued by somebody dying, and implicit in everything you're saying about existence is the claim that all of these canceled goods of future people don't mean anything, right? I mean, there's no moral weight to place on all the good things that could have happened had humanity continued, because these are hypothetical goods that accrue to no one. How is it that having everyone die painlessly in their sleep wouldn't be, on your account, a good thing? And in fact, perhaps the best possible thing we could imagine having happen. Like if you could do it, if you could push that button, you would be a moral hero of a sort that has never existed.
So I'm not quite sure how to approach this other than the way I have before. But I think one mistake that you're making is when you attribute me to the view that life is terrible. I think you're oversimplifying where the terrible things happen. So it often gets worse towards the end. So it may be that early on in life, if all's going well, you're not suffering in the kind of extreme way that you will later. Now, if you think about bringing somebody into existence, you've got to think not just about when they're 10 and when they're 20 and when they're 30, but also when they're 60, 70, and 80. You have to think about that part too. I think very few parents think about that. They don't think about the cancer that's going to ravage their future adult child's body.
Yeah, and I think like language contributes to this. Like we always talk about having children, and there's two things in there. The first is that even though the term children can actually be used to mean like someone of any age, so like you can like if someone says I have 3 children, right? Like they could be referring to adult children, right? But when you use the word child or children, generally people associate it with young children, right? Yeah, I think the phrase like having children, there's two sort of like at least 2 issues with it I see. The first is that it unduly focuses on like the young part of life, and often, not always, but often, a lot of the bad things are accrued near the end of life or in adult life. But again, not always the case. And then, so that's one issue. And then the other issue is like having is kind of passive. Like it doesn't center the fact that the person has actually got agency in this. Yeah, it would be like better, I think, to use something like creating someone, right? Because someone doesn't refer to any specific type of person or age range, and creating centers the agency the person has in it. Obviously, I'm not like perfect in this. I sometimes still say like having children and stuff, but I think using the phrase creating someone is better. So yeah, and I think that was just relevant to what Benatar was saying. Like, you've got to think about the fact that you're not just creating like a bouncing baby, you're creating someone who's going to have a full life. So you've got to think of all of those things. Cool. Okay. And I'm seeing in the chat, people are getting into like a heated discussion. If people want to like get into a heated discussion, about veganism, then like, obviously everyone knows my opinion on veganism. They know what side I'm on, but if you want to get into a heated discussion, please do it elsewhere. So like, add each other on Discord or whatever. I've seen people doing that before. Don't do it in the chat, because one, it's not completely, but it's slightly off topic. And yeah, if you're having like an aggressive debate, it's not going to make people feel like they're as able to talk in the chat, because they feel like they're interjecting in the debate, or they just feel unwelcome, right? And we want people who disagree to be able to like talk alongside each other in the chat. So yeah, if people want to do that and continue the specific debate that's going on now, please like do it elsewhere. Animal Liberation asks, Lawrence, how was your podcast with Benatar? When will that be uploaded? So just to clarify, it wasn't my podcast with Benatar. I was on a panel that also featured Benatar. It should be out in the next couple of days. Cool. And I think that's everything to address in the chat. Okay, cool. Let's continue. I think the lagging has stopped now. That's fine. It obviously was the overheating, which is one of the issues with summer and not having a cooling system. I've got my computer, my laptop doesn't have a built-in fan. So that's one issue.
Decades in the future, and often decades after the parent has died. They don't even think about that. But
And Villain Killing Dylan says, hi bro, I just got into your content. I assume that is to me, and that's not part of the conversation. They're talking to someone else. But well, welcome. Thank you so much for getting into it. Out of interest, how did you first find my content? Was it through a recommendation from a person? Did you just stumble across a video? What was it?
they should be thinking about that. That should be something that they're factoring in. And if you factor that in, then I think what you should say is, I ought not to be creating a child that's going to be susceptible or liable to this sort of experience and sort of suffering. But that doesn't mean to say that when the child has been brought into existence and is, let's say, 10 or 20, and hasn't got to that point of life yet, that it is now in that child's interests to end its life.
So on your account, and I think, quite fairly on your account, existence is quite a bit worse than that. I mean, cancer is not what makes existence bad. I mean, when you look at the kinds of lives that most people live, even up to the age of 10, it's quite rational to suppose that there's more suffering than happiness on balance.
I agree. I wasn't suggesting that there's the absence of that. And look, one analogy that I gave in the book was about going, let's say, to the theater or to the cinema. And it's making you go, and the film or the play that you're watching is not nearly as good as you thought it was going to be. But it's not so bad that you would leave. You've come out, you bought the ticket, you're there, and you're getting something out of it. Perhaps enough not to walk out of the theater. But if you'd known in advance that it was this bad, you wouldn't have come.
Right.
And I think that there are many stages of life where it's like that, where this is really not a great deal that you've got, but it's not worth walking out yet. Now, that's not to say there doesn't come a time when it's worth walking out. It's not to say there's not a time when suicide might be exactly the right option for you. But once you're there, you're sort of going to stick it out for now. But you wouldn't have come in the first place. And I think that's exactly the view we should take about existence. Not worth starting, but once you're here, and you've got this interest in continuing to exist, stick it out until such time as it really becomes unbearable, and then suicide might be reasonable.
Well, again, I feel like you're smuggling into my kind of purified case of mass death all of the other problems with suicide, which is, suicide is guaranteed to be messy and painful and leave people bereaved and all that. And so those are the interests in continuing to exist. And the interests that people have in not killing themselves entail quite a bit more than the interest in continuing to exist if I can create a case where losing one's life is completely painless, imposes no burden on anyone else, and you don't know what's going to happen and you never know that it has happened.
Right. So I think I can see where our point of disagreement is. So when I say that we've got an interest in not ceasing to exist, you think that I mean that the interest consists in either my sense of foreboding or in the bereavement that my relatives will have, and that's not what I mean.
Well, no, I'm just saying those are powerful confounding factors.
They are, and I'm happy to set those aside. I agree with you, we should set those aside.
What I'm saying additionally, David, is that your only conceivable interest in continuing to exist has to contain that life on balance is worth living, right? It has to contain some judgment about the character of life.
No, I don't think so, because I think that even when
well, at least you're saying it's not excruciating.
Well, I think even in extremists, I think when people are in that stage where death is the lesser of the two evils, I think it's still an evil. It may be the lesser of the two evils, but it's still an evil. It's still something to be regretted.
But why? Because there's no one around to suffer its continuity.
So that's the epicurean argument. So you're taking the sort of line that if you don't know about it and you and others can't experience it, then there's nothing bad about it.
Well, yeah, I would agree with that, but let's drill down further on the transition from life to death. So let's just assume, for argument's sake, that seems somewhat plausible. It is, leaving aside all of the pain and suffering that surrounds the moment of death or can surround it, the actual transition from the conscious continuity of being alive to no longer existing is something that we'd all be fairly familiar with in the act of falling asleep or going under general anesthesia, right? So there's this moment where the lights are on and then they're off, and you were more or less aware of that transition. Let's say in the general case, you're not aware of it. It's just you're aware of it retrospectively because you wake up in the morning or you come to on the gurney after surgery. I think we can leave aside whatever disanalogy there is between a brain that is dead and a brain that is sleeping. From the perspective of most conscious witnesses, there is this hiatus. There's this break in the continuity of conscious experience, and if that break continued for the rest of the all of time, there'd be no one around to suffer the deprivation of life. So how is it that beings have a continued interest in existing independent of making a claim about the value of a life?
Well, let me ask you this. So when you go to sleep at night, let's imagine you've got some sort of long-term goal or desire, and you go to sleep at night. What do you think happens at that point? Do you think that the desire or the goal gets obliterated and that when you wake up the next morning, it miraculously reforms? Or do you think that it's there in some sort of dispositional state during your sleep?
Well, it's certainly there in the sense that I have a brain that could recall the goal given the right circumstances. But if the brain never wakes up and there's no one to whom the loss of a goal accrues, there's no person who was better off having a goal and now doesn't have one.
So if your goal was to wake up the next morning and you don't wake up the next morning, don't you think your goal has been thwarted?
There's no goal seeker anymore who we can point to as the victim of that loss.
Yeah, and that's the epicurean argument. I don't think there's a knockdown argument against that position. The vast majority of humanity don't share that intuition, though. So if we are comparing intuitions, most people, and I think there's some argument as well for this position, think that death can be bad for us even if we are not around to experience its deprivation.
I think, again, for all the reasons you cite, there's so many contaminating harms and hopes and fears around death that in the general case, it does seem like a very bad thing given how much pain and suffering come in its wake. But the pro-mortalist position seems to me to be of a piece with the antinatalist position in the right circumstances, because what's motivating the antinatalist position is this judgment about the character of existence. And the judgment runs far deeper than I realized. I mean, now I realize on the basis of this conversation with you that there's no way to make existence good enough such that it is any better than not existing, which is not an intuition, obviously, that most people would share. There's no way to tune the dials of positive existence so as to make it better.
I think unless I'm misunderstanding Sam Harris, I think he's getting it the wrong way round, because what antinatalism isn't saying is that existing is always worse than not existing. It's coming into existence is always worse than never existing. But that doesn't necessarily mean that once you're here, it's always better to exit existence. Hence the debate they've just been having. So he's kind of, assuming the conclusion of the very, like he's assuming, he's like begging the question. The point he's making is assuming the conclusion of the very thing they're debating.
Better than zero. and it is much, much worse than zero, generally speaking, and for, any world we can find plausible.
So again, I think that you could hold that view, and if you do hold that view about death, then you could hold it alongside the antinatalist position, but I don't think you have to. And the reason
David,
why I don't think you...
But let me just interject one thing here. The badness of dying, again, separate from all of the ancillary pain and suffering around death, but just the badness of having, let's say in this case, your goals canceled, even though you no longer exist to have found them canceled. Think of how much weight you need to have on that side of the balance so as to cancel the goodness of no longer being subjected to the misery and the risk of even greater misery imposed on everyone by merely existing.
Yeah, I realize that. And if you ask me if there's one area where I have the greatest doubts, it's about this. It's about whether we aren't just deceiving ourselves in general about how bad death is. But I think that if we do go down that route, then even when we add some of the confounding variables that you wanted to exclude, we might have a much broader case for suicide. But I think there are sort of epistemic questions here. So let's imagine you take your own life, and you're wrong about that. Let's imagine Epicurus is wrong, and I'm right about the badness of death. Then you've done a pretty momentous thing. And if you've taken somebody else's life, you've done an even more serious thing. Whereas I think on the antinatalist question, if I'm wrong, and you would not have harmed anybody by bringing them into existence, and you hadn't brought them into existence, there's really no harm done.
Yeah, I can certainly follow you there in the sense that it seems highly unintuitive to claim that a person who declined to have a child that could have been happy is guilty of some kind of monstrous evil for not bringing that life into existence.
Doesn't seem equivalent to murdering somebody.
No, it doesn't. Except when you talk about all possible future human lives and you get into questions of existential risk, then my sympathy grows. Then I think, well, there's no telling how good life could have been. There's no telling how beautiful the universe of conscious minds could have been. And if you're turning the lights out on the universe, well, it's certainly one of the worst things that you could do. I mean, it's not as bad as creating a universe that is nothing but a hell and imposing limitless suffering on people. But let me see if I can take a kind of a bird's eye view of the situation, because this is the way I view moral questions and questions of value generally. I don't know if you're familiar with my work on this topic. Basically, I think we're confused by standard philosophical terms like morality and duty. And I think the way that makes the most sense to think about these things is to just recognize that we live in a universe of possible minds and possible experiences. There are minds of varying character, both actual and possible, that are susceptible to a wide range of experience. And we know this experience can be very, very good or very, very negative. And we obviously don't know how far that spectrum can reach in either direction, right? So we don't know how bad the worst experience might be, and we don't know how good the best experiences might be. But we have every reason to believe that they can get much worse than we have personally seen or even collectively seen, and we have every reason to believe that they can get much better than we have seen or are likely to ever see from minds, constituted differently than our own. And one of the ethical moments where we will soon face is in designing artificial minds and designing artificial intelligence, we'll have to worry whether we're building conscious minds that can suffer. I take that question seriously. That would be on your account, and really, I think any account, a terrible thing to do, to build minds that perhaps are even far more sensitive to suffering than our own, and build them to suffer in ways that perhaps we can't imagine. And this would be a bad thing whether or not we know we have done this. The worst case is we could do this in a way that we never find out we've done this, and we've just created hells and populated them in our computers. So we live in a, what I call a moral landscape that has peaks and valleys, and we are just kind of edging into the fog, seeking higher ground, both personally and collectively. This landscape has some features of a normal landscape. It's one of the reasons why I think the analogy is interesting, is that clearly there's not just one peak. There are many equivalent peaks, and they may be equivalent in terms of the well-being experience there, but they're very different in all other ways. If you're on one, you're not on another, and your mind has to function by very different properties, but they might be the same in terms of well-being. And there are valleys that are different from one another, but they might be, similarly low points in terms of the kind of suffering there. So when we're talking about questions of value and questions of morality, what I think we're talking about really are just this prospect of navigating away from the worst possible suffering for everyone towards something better, both personally and collectively. And there's no telling how good things can get. And even acknowledging all of the descriptive truths you point to of our world, that there is on balance much more suffering than happiness, or at least it's more reliably attained. Our pleasures don't last very long. We all wind up dying at some point in ways that are more or less painful and unpleasant. I think it's important to recognize that there's no telling how much that could change in the future with the right sorts of breakthroughs, right? There's no telling how good end-of-life care could get, with 1,000 years of good science under our belts. So to say that our descendants will always suffer from cancer, say, or some protracted illness, it's quite unlikely that would be true if we continue to make progress. So I basically look at this picture of the rightness or wrongness of any question reducing to a kind of navigation problem. All these experiences on offer for all the possible minds, and we know that the worst possible suffering for everyone is a terrible outcome, and virtually every other outcome, or I would say in fact every other outcome, is better than that. And we are just navigating away from the worst possible misery for everyone to something better. And you're certainly acknowledging that there are many things that are better than the worst possible misery for everyone, and non-existence is certainly one of those things that's better. But there's all of these other things that are better, and I would say, again, this is one place where we diverge. You would say that none of these things are better, no matter how good they are, than non-existence. But leaving that aside for a second, everything I'm hearing from you, I'm trying to map onto this navigation problem. And if you're going to tell me that human life, to keep it the local case here, is so reliably bad that having children, even in a circumstance where you can be pretty confident that you'll assure them what's considered a very good human life in our context, right? You're not giving birth, in Haiti during the earthquake. You're living a life of abundance in the developed world. You're telling me that life is so bad that bringing a child into this world is a monstrous evil. I can't see how that doesn't give you, really by definition, something like the pro-mortalist position, because in order to cancel that, in order to say that this misery on offer is worth going through tomorrow morning when you wake up, you have to say that death is intrinsically a terrible, terrible thing, and its badness somehow persists even when you don't exist. I don't see the basis for that. I mean, how long does death last? 3 minutes? 2 seconds?
No, forever. Unlike diamonds, which are not really forever. This is forever.
The forever is from the perspective of no one.
That's correct.
And if death lasts forever, that harm is accruing in the same place, or so I would say, as the harm of being deprived of the benefits of a good life.
No, that's exactly where we're disagreeing. But in what you've just said, I think you're saying multiple different things. In other words, at different points in your exposition, I thought you were saying something different. So at first, what I thought you were saying was that it may be that in the future, lives will be much, much better than they are now, really nearly blissful lives, because we don't know how much the science will progress and how good we can make a human life. And my response to that, was that not what you were saying?
No, I would say that's certainly possible, yeah.
Well, my response to that is that even if that's true, and I think that's unduly optimistic, I think that bad things in life are going to constantly evade our treatment, our therapy. So even if we cure cancer, there'll be something else that comes along that we'll then have to turn our attention to. But even if we set aside that, and even if we think that there is some great condition that we can get into in 100,000 years' time, or even 10,000 years' time, even 1,000 years' time, it's not clear to me that subjecting the intervening people to what we would be subjecting them to could warrant that outcome. So let's imagine we were having this conversation 20,000 years ago, where there was no anesthesia, and people had to have a leg amputated. They just cut it off. Perhaps they get a bit of grog or something, but they'd be fully conscious while they had their leg amputated, or they had a tooth pulled. And the Sam Harris of the past said, look, one day there'll be this great thing that's called anesthesia, and people won't have to have that. They won't have to go through these experiences, at least if they're in the developed world and they've got access to it. I'll say, yeah, but it's pretty indecent to put the next number of generations through what they're going to go through.
Yeah, it's basically sacrificing people so that other people who never needed to exist can solve the problems that are only brought about by their own creation. It's just like mental gymnastics to me.
Get to that point. It's just not worth it.
What you do is you pull their teeth while you amputate their legs so as to distract them.
That's not what I would recommend.
So the character of existence is the coin that you are cashing in here to run this through intuitively. The moment existence gets better and better, the balance swings. And when it gets worse and worse, the balance swings in the other direction. And I'm still hung up on a few places where our intuitions don't align. And I guess it's the collapse of antinatalism into pro-mortalism that I stuck on here. It's just, if you told me that I was going to get my leg sawed off tomorrow and every day thereafter, that's what life was now going to be like, well, then I can easily find a means of death that is better than getting my leg sawed off. The badness of death and the badness of having my goals frustrated counts as nothing in light of that kind of existence.
I don't think it counts as nothing. I think it gets defeated by the prospect of having your leg cut off without anesthesia. So if I had that prospect tomorrow, yes, I would also rather die. But if I had the prospect of having my leg cut off...
Not just tomorrow, perhaps, but I'm just saying that, every day for the rest of your life.
Yeah, that too. But let's imagine I knew this leg cutting was only going to start in 20 years' time. Then I might say, well, the badness of death is going to keep me going in the meantime, and I'm going to stick it around. And when I get a little closer to that leg cutting time, then the death would be welcome, even though it would still be an evil. It'll be the lesser of the evils. I'm granting the possibility that I'm wrong about how bad death is. That if I am wrong about that, then I think we should be pro-mortalists, but not just because we're antinatalists. I think we should be pro-mortalists on other grounds. We must try and minimize the unfortunate side effects that you're speaking about. But I don't think I have to adopt pro-mortalism because I'm an antinatalist. And I think that the method for avoiding it is by saying that death is a harm to the person who dies, or is bad for the person who dies. Ways of doing that, I've spoken about annihilation. You can speak about deprivation. There's the deprivation of death's badness. That's another way of doing it. We can argue about the merits of those different views of the badness of death, but at least on the face of it, there are arguments that death is bad, even though there is nobody who experiences that badness. So I'm not sure whether we should sort of get sidetracked by the debate about death. What we should, I think, recognize is there is a question about that. And if you're right about death, then my antinatalist view should commit me to pro-mortalism, and I'm perfectly happy to acknowledge that. If, on the other hand, I'm right about the question of death, then I am not committed to pro-mortalism just because I'm an antinatalist.
Okay, yeah, well, yeah, I certainly don't want to get bogged down here. I guess I have the hope that we can always press through and find ourselves converging.
Never the optimist.
But your pessimism may be warranted here. So I guess I'll register, for the benefit of our listeners, I'll just register the objections that have occurred to me thus far where I feel like we don't converge. And one is just on the initial architecture of this first asymmetry, this idea that you can say that being deprived of harms or being spared harms is a good thing for one who doesn't exist, but you can't say that being deprived of good things is a bad thing for one who doesn't exist. I think that initial asymmetry, which is doing a lot of work for you.
Not as much as you think.
Yeah, the truth is I don't actually think you need it to have your view, but
No.
What you do need to have your view, and this is where your view sort of slides into the pro-mortalism for me, what you do need is to have a judgment about the character of existence that is pessimistic enough to make it seem that life really isn't worth living, not only for those who don't yet exist, but those who exist in this state of mediocrity we call a podcast. Like the two of us should really, again, leaving aside imposing misery on those who love us, we should really not just be indifferent to not waking up tomorrow. We should hope it happens. We should hope it happens for everybody in some painless way so as to be spared the certain misery that is coming our way and the possible horrific amplification of the misery that is possible that we're probably not even thinking about. We're thinking about cancer. We're not thinking about surviving a nuclear war and having to live in some hellscape that one reads about in history books or sees in dystopian movies. But all of that's on the menu too, right? Or at least potentially.
Look, the miseries I'm expecting tomorrow are not so bad that I would rather be dead. At least the ones I'm expecting. That might not be true down the line.
Okay, but David, let's just focus there. So if that's how you feel about tomorrow for you, and I hand you your newborn baby, how is it that you wouldn't feel the same sort of default optimism for the prospects of your baby enjoying tomorrow?
Well, but you would, because that baby already exists, so it's not relevant to the question of antinatalism.
But that's a being that already exists, and this is why we're coming back to, I think, this fundamental disagreement between us. You keep speaking about the life that's worth living, and that does elide the difference between a life worth starting and a life worth continuing. If I had a baby in front of me, I would not kill it for its sake.
You would think it would be better that it had not been born.
Better that it not be.
Yeah, but that's the case for everyone. Why focus on a baby there? It's the same. It's the baby for Sam, for David himself, for everyone.
Born, but that's different to say that it's better for it to now die.
We're sort of disagreeing about just what the space provided is in order to put that difference. But
yeah, it depends on how bad death is, and you don't think it's bad if you avoid all those confounding variables. And I think that even if we avoid all of those, it is bad. And if I'm wrong about that and you're right, then pro-mortalism is exactly the right view to adopt. If, on the other hand, I'm right about the death question and you're wrong, then there's a way of avoiding the move from antinatalism to pro-mortalism.
I can't find a shelf to place this highly negative value, but let's just stipulate that such a shelf exists. You're not thinking about that as a reason not to die tonight. You're thinking about the fact that tomorrow could be a very good day or a normal not too bad day, right?
When I think about not dying, and I think many people, when they think about their prospective death, they don't want to be annihilated. And they're prepared to accept a lot of things to avoid that bad.
But when they think about being annihilated, they think about, again, all of the ancillary things that we have left off the table and are right to leave off the table.
I don't think it's just that.
But again, there is this paradox that people imagine death being this terrifying thing, again, leaving aside the pain of the means of death and all of that suffering. But just in the moment, people think they're afraid to lose experience. They think they're afraid to have the lights go out. They think they're afraid to be suddenly deprived of seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, thinking, feeling, and the discursive mind that would allow them to entertain their goals and their ability to remember who they are and all the rest. But we do that every single night of our lives that we fall asleep. And when we can't do that for some reason, when you're suffering from insomnia, you're struggling to get to sleep, you're waiting for the lights to go out and they won't go out, that becomes its own agony. We surrender to sleep as though to one of the greatest pleasures we ever encounter once we get exhausted enough.
Because we expect to wake up.
Well, we do, but our surrender isn't contingent upon our reiterating to ourselves that we will wake up. We're not saying I know this seems crazy, the lights are going to go out, but I have it on good authority, I'm going to wake up tomorrow and be able to live another day. We don't think about that at all. Just think of what it's like to fall asleep. In the general case, it just happens to you and you don't know what the hell happened, and all of a sudden you're waking up. But when you're struggling to get there, you can feel that what you want is for experience of the normal kind to just go away, right? You don't want to keep hearing what you're hearing or thinking what you're thinking. And so people yearn for it. Death, obviously, is not the same thing as sleep, but it could have, I would imagine, in the context of an ordinary death with all the suffering that tends to surround it, it could have very much that character where you're you're on the event horizon of some profound relief from sensory experience, and surrender to that could feel quite good and appropriate.
I don't deny that death has its charms. There's certain advantages to it. What I'm saying is that it's also got serious downsides. And that's the point that we're disagreeing on.
I think we can move on here. I can't figure out where to put those downsides, but I mean, maybe there's, I'm living in a three-dimensional moral universe and there's a fourth dimension and you found it, and yet you can't point forward, backward, left or right or up or down to indicate it to me. But wherever that place is, you have to put an enormous downside in order to swing the balance in favor of continuing to live.
I agree. I agree about that.
Okay.
It has to be an enormous downside, and I happen to think that it is.
At least we understand our confusion at that point. I think we both agree that people, to use philosophical jargon here, that people aren't subjectively incorrigible, which is to say people aren't perfect authorities about anything, even about the character of their own experience. So a person can be, rather bad at judging how happy he is, or, a person can think that he loves his wife and kids more or less all the time, but he can be wildly wrong about how often he actually feels love or expresses love. So people aren't perfect judges of whether their lives are good in any way, necessarily. But there's this paradox that people can become both better judges of what's going on, and their judgments can in fact be a factor in dictating the quality of their life. Judgments, whether veridical or not, can change how one feels in each moment, and life can get much better or worse depending on how one pays attention to what it's like to be you. On some level where we have to take people's word, and people have to take their own word for how good or bad life is, or how worth it is or was to go through periods of suffering. How do you think about that? There are people who will tell you, obviously, it's a very common experience, that they've gone through something that seems objectively terrible, or it would be something they would be genuinely terrified to endure had you told them it was going to happen to them. But going through the experience, they are empowered by it. They feel like it has brought greater meaning to their life. They have new capacities that they didn't imagine.
Yeah, I feel like this whole thing is the instrumental value of suffering, right? Like, once we're here, we've evolved in such a way where suffering can be beneficial to us, which is quite twisted. In some ways we need suffering to be able to live, practically speaking, which is kind of fucked. But yeah, even though suffering can have instrumental value to those who exist, it doesn't mean that doesn't count as a reason to create the person, because the suffering is merely essentially it's problem solving, or it's a warning system, but you don't need, or it's something that you have to take on as a sacrifice to achieve some greater benefit. But those three things aren't relevant to someone who doesn't exist, right? They don't need, they don't have interests in this greater achievement, so they don't need to they have no need for the suffering there. They have no need for the information sensitivity, and they have no need for whatever the third thing I said was. I've blanked on it now. So yeah, suffering can have instrumental value for those who exist, but does it count as a reason to create someone? No.
And they would ever have. How do you view those chapters in life like that in light of what you're saying?
Well, I think you're correct that people are not reliable judges of their own quality of life. That there are all kinds of ways in which people can err. I also think you're correct that the view you do hold can form a kind of feedback loop into the quality of your life. So that if you think that the quality of your life is better than it actually is, it actually becomes a bit better than it actually would otherwise have been if you didn't have that attitude.
Right.
But it doesn't mean that your view becomes completely correct. It's just that your life sort of alters in the direction of your perception. So I think all of that is true. And I think it's also true that people do try to find meaning in the unpleasant features of life. They try to benefit in some way from the suffering and the other bad experiences and the other misfortunes that they suffer. And I think that's all to the good. It's good if somebody can try to harvest some good out of that bad. But none of that, I think, would justify the infliction of the bad in the first place. If you think, for example, about, a rape victim who does something empowering as a result of that awful experience and finds some kind of meaning in life through that by perhaps helping other victims of this sort of assault, it's good that they can derive some solace, as it were. But that wouldn't warrant in any way the infliction of that sort of act on them in the first place. And I would say something similar about bringing somebody into existence. If you bring them into existence and they find meaning and they seek purpose and they try to see the good in life, that's all great. But it doesn't mean that you were warranted in the first place in creating them.
You are making a judgment about the character of existence, and you're making a kind of vicarious judgment for others. You're surveying, what the careers of various people have been like from birth to death, and you're assuming you know what it's like to, or some semblance of what it's like to live all those lives and endure all those experiences. And that's how you're coming to this view of the value of existence. I think there's no way around that you're making a judgment, and we know we're bad at making these judgments, both for ourselves and presumably we're bad at doing it for others. And so a lot of this comes out of behavioral economics. We know that people overestimate the durable effects of both good and bad experiences. So like if I told you, you'd have to spend the rest of your life as a paraplegic, you would very likely, if you're a normal person, have a far too pessimistic view of what the effect would be on your happiness of that change in your life. There's this initial terrible degradation of your happiness, but what tends to happen is people become, more or less as happy as they've always been once they get their act together. For most things, this is true of, almost every terrible thing that people recover from in some basic sense. So we're bad judges of that, but I can just imagine if you could take a poll of every person who's ever existed on their deathbed and ask them two questions. You ask them, do you regret having existed? And, would you want to do this again? Would you want a second chance at a life very much like the one you lived?
But the thing is, that's someone who already exists, basically opting to extend their life in their view, because what they're not like, it's not like they are just like starting a new life and it's someone else living it. They're being asked, would you like to live a second life? So the way that it's being framed for them is basically they're extending their life because it's still them. They're just reverting back to being a baby, which is not the same as antinatalism. With antinatalism, the person is not making a decision on their own behalf. It's two people creating a third person.
It seems to me that's the only sort of exhaustive sampling of the information space we could have. And I would expect those polls to run very much counter to what you're suggesting here. And again, I think it's coherent to say that everyone could be wrong on some level here. But I would expect people to say, I'm glad I lived and I would like to continue living or to live another life. I feel like that's probably where most people, apart from the people who just suffered the worst possible lives, I feel like most people, even people who had classically hard lives, would say that. Do you have a different intuition there?
No, I think you're correct. Probably not as often as you think, because I've known at least some people who have found my views to be correct when they've reached that point in their life, where the suffering is just unspeakable, and they think at that point nothing is worth what I'm going through now. But I wouldn't be surprised if more people, a majority of people, had your response. But I would still distrust it. I think what's going on is a kind of adaptation, a kind of adaptive preference even. So people find themselves in existence, and now they try to rationalize this in some way, and they adapt to their circumstances. So let's imagine you showed me slaves who were happy to be slaves, and they were born into slavery, and they said...
Which again, like what Benatar is saying here, like these adaptive preferences, like I guess these could be good for the people who exist because it's sort of like alleviating them somewhat of the burden of existence. But it's something that we've got to be intensely skeptical of when thinking about whether we should create another person, and which means that they are going to have to, come into existence and live a life. So these things can be advantageous to us, but we need to be like deeply skeptical of them when it comes to making a judgment about whether to create someone else.
Look, I'm glad I was born, even though I was born a slave. I think I would still offer the advice that you would not be breeding more slaves. Even though they reassured me that they were happy, I'd say, don't do it. Don't bring more in. Not a good idea.
Well, again, that's just by comparison with the free state of non-slaves that we value more. But I view all of human existence as analogous to some form of slavery by comparison. If we compare our lives at present with the unimaginably good lives that are possible for beings like ourselves, then we're the worst form of slaves, no doubt. But it still doesn't cause me to say that these lives...
But we're all sort of like, in a way, slaves to our biological needs, right? Like we need to get food, water, comfort. Generally, we need like long-term goals, try and find a sense of meaning, all these things. We're slaves to. We have to chase, and they dictate our actions and how we live our lives. and they are pretty all-encompassing. You know, they basically dictate every aspect of our lives. So, yeah, there's a case to be made that we are slaves to our own biological desires.
Lives aren't worth living, and one of the reasons why they might be worth living to people other than ourselves are our descendants who could live in a much better world than the one we're living in.
I don't think that hundreds of generations of enslavement is worth it, even if the outcome is going to be eventual freedom for some future generation.
What if we live in a world where, we've had, there's now 7 billion people alive. I forget what the estimates are. I think it's
about 106 billion, I think.
Yeah.
As I recall, have ever lived. Of course, the calculations vary depending on when you think humans started.
Right.
And what counts as a human.
I've heard the same number of about 100 billion. So let's say there's been 100 billion Homo sapiens thus far, and 7 billion are currently alive. If we're going to become a species or a line of future species of, space-faring, unimaginably advanced beings who, take full creative control over their evolution, that seems possible if we don't do something incredibly stupid in the meantime. I mean, really, it feels like we have a 100-year bottleneck here that we have to get through in order to have the most Star Trekian sort of future. 100 billion is like nothing.
This is just like sci-fi optimism. Like, he's just watched one too many sci-fi films and now he's sort of like blown away on like, oh, this could be our future. But it's like, well, actually, yeah, like Benatar said, one, I mean, I don't think we need to bring people into existence. I don't think we need a future. Two, all those intervening generations are going to suffer to get to that point. And even in Star Trek, people still suffer, like, do people really think that once we become spacefaring, we still won't have wars and stuff like this? And we'll just be exposed to like new, like being a spacefaring civilization or species, like we're going into the unknown, into a whole new environment. Obviously that's going to come with it new problems, new issues, new forms of suffering. Yeah, and then it's like that will likely mean we increase our population. If anything does go wrong, there's more victims to fall foul of it. All of this sort of stuff. So it just comes across to me as like this just naive sci-fi optimism where he's seen one too many Star Trek episodes.
Compared to the billions upon billions upon billions that may yet exist to live lives that are good enough so that they look back on us the way we look back on the poor cavemen and women who, were struggling to start fires and not cannibalize one another.
Well, obviously you and I are looking back at those cave dwellers very differently, because I'm sorry they reproduced.
And there's nothing I can put on the balance in the future that seems to make anyone's sacrifice worth enduring.
Well, let me ask you this. Let's imagine that you knew that your children and your grandchildren, let's say, and your great-grandchildren would suffer unspeakably, but then the subsequent generations will all have blissful lives. Would you breed the next generation? I mean, they've done it already, but if you could go back and make the decision, would you do that? If you knew the next few generations would suffer unspeakably, and that was the cost that had to be paid in order to yield some massive benefit for some future people with whom you've got no direct contact, would you do it? Because I think there's something indecent about that.
Well, it is a difficult question, especially if you turn the suffering up high enough, then it becomes something that I feel like I could never impose on somebody else against their will.
That's exactly my view. And I think the suffering is pretty high. You don't have to look at it on a day-to-day basis. Look at it over the course of somebody's lifespan. There's a lot of suffering there that you're inflicting, and also the risk of suffering. I mean, I think the risk is even sufficient.
But the crucial difference here is that it is suffering that in most cases, or at least in the case that I could foresee by procreating, it's suffering that the person themselves, once they become as adequate as I am to judge the character of their own lives, the person, him or herself, will say, I want more of this. I'm happy to be here. What do you want to get for lunch?
Yeah, but would you expect a drug addict to say? Like, we are all addicted to things like attachment. We're all addicted to the needs and desires we have, like sex, food, water, comfort, relationships, all of this sort of stuff. What answer do you expect to get from someone who is attached to all these things?
Well, first of all, there are a lot of people of whom that's not true. There are a lot of depressive people out there. There are a lot of people who are suicidal.
That's true.
And you've got to think about the parents who bred those children.
But the ethical decision here is, if you could foresee the fact that your children would be miserable, unendurably miserable and never recover, well, then of course you would have some kind of ethical duty not to procreate. I fully agree there. But I mean, so the situation you're asking me to consider is kind of analogous to your saying that if I knew that I could just torture someone in a dungeon, just one person for 50 years. And this would bring about some great benefit elsewhere. You'd have millions of happy people. If only I would torture this one person in my basement, would I do that? it's very difficult for me to say yes to that, given the details. But I would say that we actually do say yes to that by default in other ways that no one has to own, just by organizing a world that is as inequitable as it is. I mean, the fact that we participate in an economy that leaves some people living lives that one would argue are just barely worth living.
And Sam Harris bought into all of that and perpetuates it. Like, he had kids. Like, sure, he could say, oh, well, I can reasonably expect them to have just as good as life as I, and obviously he's in a very privileged position. But you have no guarantee. Some of the richest people on earth, they will also have very harsh lives because of some sort of psychological issue they have, or some trauma they have, or whatever. It doesn't, just because you're in a good situation doesn't mean that you're guaranteed for your children to have good lives. There's still the risk there, and it's not clear why he thinks it's okay to take the risk.
So as to produce the goods we all enjoy and then discard. There are inequalities in our world that are glaring enough that we all are sort of allowing people to be tortured in our basements for nothing like the benefit that you are suggesting. But if you spell it out too clearly, it becomes insupportable once you ask me to do the torturing.
Right, but even if I'm not asking you to do the torturing directly, but I'm asking you to think about the suffering that will occur, I think if you think carefully about that, you should say, I ought not to do it. And I'm speaking now about the future people case, because the case you've provided is more complicated, because you're going to torture one person in order to bring some benefit to already existing people.
Right.
And so maybe some people will think that can be justified. But even if you think that can be justified, I don't think that's going to imply anything for the case I'm imagining, where you're going to inflict pain and suffering on these beings in order to ensure that there are future people who will have these blissful lives. And that if you didn't inflict this pain and suffering, then those future people's blissful lives wouldn't exist.
So I will grant you totally that if I expect my children to have lives that are not worth living, it becomes ethically problematic to bring them into existence, even if we can imagine that they stand a chance of having children who would have better lives, and that my descendants could then kind of climb out of this well of suffering I've prepared for them. But what I'm expecting, and certainly what most people expect when they have kids, if they think about this at all, are people very much like themselves who have lives that they want to maintain the moment they find themselves in existence, right? So that they're having lives that seem intrinsically worth preserving, at least most of the time. So we're not in the situation of consciously imposing immeasurable suffering on future generations that is never compensated by a life worth living.
But you're telling me about the psychology of people.
Right.
And I'm saying we need to look beyond the psychology of people, because if people are just adapting to their circumstances and they're thinking, well, on balance, I'd rather be here. If that's an unreliable judgment, then we shouldn't use those judgments that they're making as a basis for reproducing more people who will suffer quite terrible things.
Except the only basis for making this judgment ever is the psychology of everyone who can be asked this question, is life worth living? And again, when we have ways of triangulating on self-deception and adaptation and all of that, but even in your own case, so you're bringing all of your powers of philosophical self-awareness to bear on the question of whether your life is worth living. You might be deceived about it to some degree. Let's say you go on vacation and I ask you, how was your vacation to Rome? And you say, oh, it was great. And then we have a more searching conversation than that, and it begins to seem that your time in Rome was dogged by jet lag and other forms of dissatisfaction that make it seem like, in retrospect, not as good as you recalled at first. So we know that you're not subjectively incorrigible either, but you're still making this judgment about the character of existence. We're not getting out of our psychology for this. We're talking about the character of human experience.
What would you say about the slave case?
First, I could certainly imagine a happy slave. That's not a non sequitur, or that's not an oxymoron.
Well, let's put it this way. I don't know what you mean by a happy slave, but let's imagine you've got somebody who's enslaved, they're subjected to a certain amount of brutality, there's piles of unpleasantness in their life. But when you ask them, are you glad that you came into existence? And they answer yes. Would you now use that datum as part of a justification for breeding further slaves who would live in those sorts of circumstances?
Again, we can't smuggle in too much under the rubric of slavery. Slavery is only slavery when you can imagine some alternative form of freedom that others enjoy or that is easily attainable.
Right, but I'm presenting that case to you because you need to think about a scenario where you can think about the alternatives and think about them quite vividly.
Yeah, but I'm just saying that, again, it doesn't do so much work for me because I think our current circumstance is slavery by some other metric, right? Clearly, human life could be reliably bad enough so that we would say there's really no point in it. The character of experience is what really matters to me, and I would argue it's really the only thing that can matter to anyone who exists to have things matter at all. All we have is consciousness and its contents as a place in which to locate, value.
So that is another assumption, and there'd be a lot of people who disagree with that assumption.
I hesitate to go down that path, but I've never heard a coherent utterance that pretended to be a disagreement to that assumption. I mean, or at least it never seemed coherent to me. If you're going to tell me that there's something that's extraordinarily important and valuable, and it would be a moral wrong to destroy this thing, but this thing has no experience in and of itself. It's not a mind, and there is no conscious mind, actual or potential, that will ever experience this thing. Right? This is a corner of the universe that is dark and will be forever unexplored and has no effect on anything else in the universe. So it's completely isolated, but it is nevertheless incredibly important, and we should care about it. That's like a square circle. That is a logically impossible thing, given the way I define these terms. The only reservoir of value is the actual or potential change in the experience of some conscious system. We're talking about subjective non-existence. We're talking about beings who don't exist in the space they need to exist in order to enjoy or suffer any change in the universe.
So you would go on the experience machine, and you'd think that people who wouldn't are just confused.
So let's remind people or inform them about what the experience machine is. Do you want to prop up that thought experiment?
Sure, it's a thought experiment of Robert Nozick, and he imagines this scenario where you get offered the opportunity to be plugged into this experience machine. When you're on the experience machine, you're not aware that you're on it. You think that this is real life. And in advance of going on the machine, you could choose whichever experiences you want to have for the rest of your biological life. You then get attached to the machine, to get put to sleep and get fed these experiences. Because you've chosen them, presumably you would have chosen just positive experiences or maximize the number of positive experiences that you can have. And the question is, if offered this choice, would you go on the machine or would you not? And most people who are offered this choice don't want to go on the machine. There's some, of course, who do, but most say they would decline the machine.
This is a very interesting thought experiment for reasons that I think Nozick couldn't fully anticipate. I think this experiment...
They might get into it, but it's also interesting to think the opposite. So a lot of people will say they won't go on the machine because, and often people say, well, that shows that people value truth or being in contact with reality. But it's interesting, if you flip it, it seems like so if you flip it so that someone comes to you and says, let's say you're 40 years old, you've had a decent life, you've enjoyed it so far, by and large, but you've actually been on the experience machine for 40 years. Like, this is the experience machine, you're already on it. And they give you the opportunity to come off the experience machine. I mean, it seems reasonable to me to assume that actually there would probably be a lot fewer people that would come off it than go on it. And yeah, it's just interesting to think. I mean, a lot of people, they use it as this shows that we value truth and being in contact with reality. But actually, a lot of people will shy away from reality and truth if it's uncomfortable to how they live their lives. You see this a lot with behavior change. If you're trying to get someone to change their behavior in some way, and yeah, it's maybe the same with the experience machine, like coming off it rather than going on it. But I think they maybe get into that because I have a vague memory of them getting into it.
Is aging better and better, and is becoming more and more interesting given the prospect of AI and recent quirky arguments in philosophy. The simulation argument of Nick Bostrom. However seriously one takes the prospect that we could be living in an experience machine already, it's certainly less crazy than it would have been when Nozick wrote his book. But I have a few intuitions here that I don't totally trust. And I think what happens here is when people recoil from the idea of being in the experience machine, I guess a more modern version of this is the Matrix, they smuggle in, as they do on many of these other questions we're touching, they smuggle in some associated concerns that really are not intrinsic to it, or that you have to hold to the side to actually think about it. So for instance, people care whether they're in touch with reality, right? And then you can ask, why do you care about that? It seems to promise the difference between a fake experience and a real experience, or a justified form of well-being and an unjustified form of well-being. And those distinctions break down, or certainly can break down, the more you analyze our entanglement with reality in the first place. The one part of the experience machine that would trouble me, that I think we could get over, which we could just fundamentally change, is the issue of not being actually in relationship with other conscious minds. One version of the experience machine would be you're essentially in a dream state, where you're, however pleasant the dream, the people you meet, the people you're in relationship to, they could be the most interesting people you've ever met and the most beautiful people, and you have these incredibly rewarding relationships, but in reality, they're zombies, or they're avatars, they're figments of code, and you are not actually in relationship with anybody, right? So the falsity of that circumstance matters to people. But of course, the Matrix need not be like that. These could be, artificial intelligences that actually are conscious, right? So you could be in a simulated world populated by conscious beings that are every bit as conscious as they seem and are indistinguishable from biological people as far as their experience goes. So that changes things, or could change things massively for people. The uncanniness of the experience machine isn't going to get me to balk here. I do think consciousness is the reservoir of value. The only reasons why the experience machine would be undesirable, from my point of view, would have to be things that would be a matter of conscious thoughts and attitudes and associations that I would have that would diminish the quality of that experience. So I just gave you one. This beautiful woman who you think you're married to in the experience machine is in fact just a confection of ones and zeros that some evil genius has created for you, for your amusement. You're not actually in a relationship. Well, then that matters to me, given all of the dominoes that start falling in the negative direction, the moment I have to take that on board and realize that, everything isn't as it seems.
Right. So I was just wanting to clarify your position. I don't think it's profitable for us to go down and examine whether this is the correct view or not, but I think your view is more controversial than you would recognize. And there are some people who do find the experience machine to be good evidence that it's not just conscious states that matter.
It's actual and potential conscious states. So one of the reasons why it's good to be in touch with reality, or so I would say, is that reality matters whether you're aware of it or not, right? Reality is what's there determining the future state of your conscious experience, and it's a thing you're going to bump into in the dark when you're unaware of the terrain. And so, all things being equal, you want to have your beliefs about your circumstance to be in some register with your actual circumstance, because that's the only thing that's going to spare you extraordinarily unpleasant surprises. We have this bias, and I think it's a well-founded one, against being delusional, however pleasant the delusions could be. But there is some construal of our current circumstance which does reveal it to be a kind of experience machine. There's a dreamlike quality. I mean, even just speaking, just neurologically, where is our experience coming from? What is your brain doing to produce it? And how much of the real world is getting in? We are having a kind of controlled hallucination much of the time. One could even say all of the time. And given our growing capacity to change ourselves with our technology, the moment we start hooking our brains directly to computers and having something like virtual reality piped in directly, then this experience machine is coming whether we like it or not.
I worry I've distracted you. All I want to do is to flag what I took to be a somewhat controversial assumption, and I worry we've gone down a line we perhaps shouldn't go down.
I think it is interesting.
It is interesting, that it is.
Our listeners can tell us whether we just bore them to death and ruin their experience machine.
They can reprogram.
So what does your view do to considerations of population ethics, which are these long-standing problems in moral philosophy, which I've tried to think about? I wrote a little bit about Derek Parfit in at least two of my books, The Moral Landscape and Waking Up. Parfit has some great thought experiments about the paradoxes of thinking about aggregate well-being. How do we summarize the well-being of billions of people? And he has an especially famous thought experiment titled The Repugnant Conclusion. Do you think the antinatalist view extends our ability to resolve some of these paradoxes?
I do indeed. I think that many of those population problems can really be dissolved if you accept my arguments.
Let's spend a little time there, because people find this area fascinating.
Well, first of all, there's the non-identity problem.
Very quickly, just on this. So obviously Benatar, he's going to give a summary here, but so Benatar goes over this in his book. I read that a while ago, so I need to revisit it. I know there's also a paper, sorry, there's also a paper by someone who, I forget who they are, but they actually contest that Benatar's the antinatalism, or Benatar's asymmetry, resolves the issue in population ethics that he claims it does. I'm going to play the video and try and find that paper, just in case people want to see it. But yeah, I forget who the person was, so I'll try and find it, and then I'll put it in the chat if I find it.
And that is the problem about whether you could harm somebody by bringing them into existence. And there are different versions of that problem, but I suppose the most acute version is when you think that the life that is started is a life that's worth living. And so the question is, let's imagine you could either conceive a child now that will suffer quite badly, but still have a life that's worth living, or you could wait a while and conceive some other child that will not suffer anything like the way that the first child would. So in other words, the timing of your procreation will alter the identity of the person who's brought into existence.
Right.
Let's imagine the person decides not to delay and they have the first child. Then the question is, have you done anything bad? Have you harmed that child? And what people often want to say is that because the alternative scenario is one in which that child would not have existed, you haven't harmed that child, at least so long as the life is a life that's worth living. course, if you think that the life is not worth living, in one sense, namely not worth starting, you can say, yes, having that child does harm that child. If you'd waited and had the other child, you would have harmed that child, perhaps not as badly as you harmed the first child, but you've nonetheless harmed it. And so I think that this can solve the non-identity problem. The repugnant conclusion is the conclusion of an argument in which you can either have one world in which you have a small number of people with very high quality of life, or a second world in which the quality of life is slightly lower, but there's sufficient additional people that the total amount of happiness, as it were, in that world is better. And at least on some views, the second world is preferred to the first world. If you then continue this process and you keep imagining successive worlds which have increasing larger populations, but the quality of life of any individual is reduced, you end up with what Derek Parfit calls world Z, or Z in American terms, which is a world in which people have lives that are just barely worth living, but there's sufficient number of them that the total happiness or utility in that world is greater than in the very first world that you imagined. And on these views that think the total amount of utility is what you should be aiming at, world Z is better than world A, and Derek Parfit thinks that that is a repugnant conclusion.
Right. So I just want to spell that out a little more. It can be hard for people to understand it if hearing it for the first time. So you imagine a world where, let's say there's 1 billion people who have just the best conceivable lives. It's as good as it can possibly get. We can barely imagine how good it is. And that's where you're starting. And then on the assumption that more is better, that, having more happy people is better than having fewer happy people, you could create an alternate world alongside it, which is where people are a little bit less happy, but just a little bit. I mean, it's still just an unimaginably good world, and there are many, many more people. So, we go from 1 billion, super happy people to 1 trillion almost super happy people. Well, clearly that's better. That intuition can be justified by our core ethical intuitions that it's sort of good to spread the wealth around, right? It's good for people who are enjoying some real abundance to make perhaps minor sacrifices to help other people.
It's not quite drawing on that same intuition, because when you want to spread the wealth around, you're sort of spreading it among existing people.
Right.
Whereas this thought experiment is about 2 alternative universes, and you've got to choose between them.
Right. And this is sort of where it runs afoul of your antinatalist intuition.
Yeah, this is like if you had, I don't know, let's say 10 people with 10 bottles of water each. Spreading the wealth around would make sense if there was another person who maybe had 5 bottles of water, and you had, a few of the people who had 10 bottles gave 1 of their bottles or 2 of their bottles to this person who has less. So that brings them up to the general number that everyone else has. That would be like spreading the wealth around. But having 10 people with 10 bottles of water and creating an additional person, and then requiring those 10 original people to like give away 1 of their bottles each, say for the sake of argument, to this new person, that wouldn't be spreading the wealth around in my view. That would just be like taking stuff away from existing people so that you can feel like you've done a good thing by creating someone else. And all you've done is create the need, in this example, for a bottle of water, and then taken water away from existing people and given it to that person who didn't need to exist in the first place. Obviously, the water is analogous to well-being, but yeah, it just makes no sense to me.
As well, but there is this intuition that more extraordinarily happy lives are better than fewer. And if you make the increment of reducing happiness small enough and add enough people to the other world, it can seem like a completely straightforward choice between world A and world B. But if you just continue that process long enough, all the way to Z, you wind up with a world which, as you say, is immensely populated with lives that are just barely worth living. And these are, on assumption, truly terrible lives by comparison with anything that we would recognize as being happy ones. Your antinatalist position just steamrolls over all of that, saying all of these lives are on balance not worth living.
Blocks the move from world A to world B. You wouldn't think that the addition of further people would be warranted.
Again, I'm coming at this from a very different angle, and I've always thought that Parfit's paradoxes here are somewhat analogous to Zeno's paradoxes, where they seem compelling on their own terms, but then there's undoubtedly some way of thinking about them that reveals that they're not compelling at all. I mean, Zeno's classic paradox of if you shoot an arrow at a target, it first must go halfway and then go another half of the way and then another half of the way, and then on that analysis it never gets there. And then some developments in mathematics, summing an infinite series has proved that you need not be constrained by the way Zeno was thinking about these things. And I've always hoped that something similar could happen with Parfit. I guess one move I make on my own terms here is that perhaps the repugnant conclusion isn't that repugnant, because the lives that are barely worth living are more or less our own. This is where you sort of cross into barely worth living. I mean, this has got to at least resonate with you a little bit, that life as we know it is where you would draw the line between worth living and not.
There are some philosophers who've said that we are in that world Z, and that they think, because they're sort of optimists, that when you look at it that way, then you think world Z isn't as bad as it's otherwise thought to be. But that doesn't bring me comfort, though.
Right.
It's bad enough.
Right.
But these other population problems that Derek Parfit comes from really arise from the non-identity problem, because if the non-identity problem can be solved, then he doesn't need to move on to the other theories that lead to the other population problems.
Right.
And so if you think the non-identity problem can be solved in the way I'm suggesting, you don't need to move on to those other theories that yield other problems.
David, it has been a fascinating conversation, at least for me. These are the kinds of conversations that make life just barely worth living. So thank you for that. Is there anything else you think we should touch to tie this up, or did we run through every
There's so many things, but I think we've had a good discussion about some issues, and it's probably better to leave it at that than just to touch very briefly on some others. So I just want to thank you for your interest and for your very thoughtful engagement.
Yeah. Where should we point people to your presence online? Do you do?
Cool. Well, I think that is it. So that was the OG Benatar Sam Harris conversation. Yeah, I hadn't listened to that for quite a while. But actually, like, interestingly, it's interesting. I've had this experience with quite a few things, like including Gary Rofsky's speech on the vegan topic, on like when you first listen to something like that, because that conversation with Sam Harris is quite like foundational for a lot of people, because it's like the first sort of maybe not comprehensive, but first like significant introduction they get to antinatalism. And so I can remember like the first time I was listening to that conversation, you know, just everything was so new and interesting to me, and it was challenging, you know, ways that I thought about things, and like going back and listening to it now, I still enjoy it and it's interesting to listen to. But it's like sorry, my fucking wind stuff. Yeah, and it's like interesting to listen to, but it's stuff that like now I talk about like all the time. It's well trodden ground. It's not new stuff to me. It's not novel. So it's like listening to it has a different character now, which is quite interesting. But anyway, so that was that was the conversation between Sam Harris and David Benatar. Hopefully everyone enjoyed it. Thank you everyone for joining me and watching it. Thank you for engaging in the chat, although a bit less at each other's throats next time, please. And I think that is everything. Yeah, the next big thing coming up is that the panel that I was on will be released. That will be coming out very soon. Next couple of days is probably when it will come out. So that'll be very cool. I've got a video. There's no video today. I know in the last stream, I think I said there was going to be one today. There's not going to be one today. I did this instead. There's going to be a video on Wednesday that's coming out about an insanely unhinged Christian woman. So yeah, that's coming out Wednesday, and then Sunday there's another outreach video. So yeah, hopefully everyone enjoys those as well. Cool. I think